17 people were still alive in Rotbrook, and the man who had burned the rest was sitting on a horse in the middle of it, writing the number into a ledger. He was not in a hurry. He licked his thumb, turned the page, and wrote us down the way a butcher writes a weight on the outside of a sack he is not planning to open again. I learned his name later. Sabin Krell, tax officer of Grey Fen. That morning, all I knew was that he counted us out loud and got it wrong by one, because I was face down in the ash and he did not count the dead. My name is Kellen Rowe. 3 days before that morning, I was a line cook in a diner off a truck road, 16 hours into a double, and a fryer basket went over onto my arm. I remember the sound the grease made. I remember the floor coming up at me. I do not remember a hospital, because there was not one. I woke up in ash with somebody else's body, and the body was in worse shape than mine had been. 2 ribs cracked on the left, feet wrapped in sacking, one hand already burned by a fire I had not been at. The village had called that body the Ditch Boy. He had no name at all. He had begged at the ford for 2 winters. He had died when the torches came through, and I got what was left of him. Then Krell's outrider came back down the lane to check the bodies for rings and boots, and he found one of them moving, which annoyed him more than it surprised him. He did not draw a blade. He put his boot into my ribs, the cracked side, twice, the way you test a sack for rot, and I heard the sound my own chest made from the inside. I got a mouthful of ash and I did not scream, because screaming costs air, and I did not have any air to spend. I lay there and counted his horse's legs so I would have something to count. He called out that the Ditch Boy was still breathing. Krell did not look up from the ledger. He said then the number stands at 17, and he wrote out through the gap where the gate used to be. That was my whole introduction to this world. A boot in the ribs, a number, and a man who did not consider me worth the ink he was already spending on the page. The fires had gone out on their own by then. What was left of Rotbrook was 32 houses of black sticks, one standing barn wall, a stone well, and a smell that got into the back of my throat and never fully left. 17 survivors. I counted them myself once I could stand. 9 adults, 6 children, 1 man who was going to die before evening from a spear wound in the belly, and an old woman who was already sweeping. That is the part nobody warns you about. The old woman was sweeping. Her entire village was cinders, and she was moving ash off a doorstep that had no door and no house standing behind it. Her name was Mira Sedge. She was about 70. She had a broom made of tied twigs, and when I asked her what she thought she was doing, she said the step was hers, and the ash was not. She told me the grain was gone. All of it. Krell had taken the winter store as tax arrears, and when Rotbrook could not make up the difference, he had taken the difference in fire. I asked what was left. She showed me, which took about 9 seconds. Half a sack of barley with mouse holes in it, a jar of pickled turnip, and 11 eggs in a basket lined with straw. 17 people and 11 eggs. Winter was 6 weeks out. The fields had been standing grain that morning, and they were black stubble by the time the sun cleared the ridge. Then a girl came out from behind the barn wall to look at me, and everything I did for the next year started with her face. She was 9. Her name was Wen. She had a burn across the back of one hand, and she had not eaten in 4 days, and she was light enough that the wind coming off the ford actually moved her sideways. She did not ask me for food. That is the thing that got me. A hungry child asks. She had already worked out that asking produced nothing, so she had stopped asking, and she just watched me with her jaw set like a small, tired adult. I have cooked for drunks at 2 in the morning. I have cooked for a man who came in still wearing the suit he had buried his father in. I have never in my life wanted so badly to put a plate down in front of somebody. So I got up. My ribs told me exactly what they thought of that. I found a cracked iron pot in the ruin of the alehouse. I found the well still standing, and I started doing arithmetic on barley and eggs. And that is when the world hung a page of writing in the air about a hand's width from my nose, and I nearly went straight back down into the ash. It said, Conquest Kitchen, bound to Kellen Rowe. Cook level 1. Bound servants, none. Territory rank, ash ground. 3 counters, glowing quietly over a dead village. I want to be honest about my first reaction because people expect a man to be brave when a page of light opens in front of his face. I swore, loudly and at length. Mira Sedge told me not to use that word within hearing of the children. The page did not go away. It hung there being patient, the way a menu board is patient. Under the counters there was 1 line of rules, and that line turned out to be the shape of my whole life from then on. It said, you may cook only for one who is marked as your enemy. If he eats to the last bite, he is bound to you, will and soul, for as long as he lives. If he leaves anything at all, he remains your enemy, and he can never be bound by your food again. I read it 4 times. Then I read the shorter line underneath it, which was worse. It said, "For one who is not your enemy, the fire will not light." So I tested it, because of course I tested it. I had half a sack of hulled barley, a girl who weighed nothing, and a system that had just told me the one thing I could not do with either of them. I built a fire ring out of hearthstones from the alehouse. I laid in dry rafter splinters, which are the best kindling in the world, and there were about 400 of them lying loose. I struck a spark off Mira's flint. Nothing happened, not the way wet wood does nothing. The spark landed on dry tinder in still air and went out like it had been pinched between 2 fingers. I tried it 9 times and got 9 dead sparks. Then I sent Wen to stand by the well, out of sight of the fire ring, and I struck the flint again with nobody in front of me but ash and a cold pot. The tinder caught on the first strike and burned so hard it took the hair off my forearm. I beat it out with my palms, which was stupid, and sat down on a hearthstone and understood the exact shape of the trap I was standing in. The fire would light. The fire would light gladly for anybody in the world who wanted me dead. It would not light for a 9-year-old girl who wanted a bowl of barley. I could feed an entire barony, as long as the entire barony hated me. I could not feed the people standing next to me, and there were 17 of them, and 2 of them were under 5. I went back and told Mira Sedge that I could not cook for the village. She said she had not asked me to. I said I meant it as a rule, and not as an excuse, and she looked at me a long moment and went back to sweeping. Then a second page opened, smaller than the first, and this one had a clock on it, and the clock was already counting down. It said, "First task, feed one who has come to kill you. 1 hour and 11 minutes remaining. Failure closes the kitchen for 9 days. 9 days, winter 6 weeks out, 11 eggs, and a system that would lock itself shut for 9 days if nobody turned up to murder me inside the hour." So I stood in the middle of a dead village with 2 cracked ribs and half a sack of barley, and I found myself actively hoping that somebody dangerous was on the road. Somewhere in that minute, I stopped being a man this world had happened to and started being a man who was going to happen to it. I was still frightened. I had simply found a use for the fear. I put Bort, a boy of about 12 with one arm strapped in a splint, up on the standing barn wall and told him to watch the ridge road and shout the moment anything appeared on it. Then I went to work, because the clock said 55 minutes now, and I was not going to spend a single one of them being amazed at a floating page. Here is the first true thing about cooking that this world had apparently never considered. You do not need good ingredients. You need heat, salt, time, and something with a bone in it. Rotbrook had no salt in any house that still had a floor, but the burned barn had a block of gray lick salt put out for the oxen, half melted into the ground and covered in soot and straw. I chipped 4 pounds of it free with a broken door hinge. It was filthy. I did not care in the slightest. Salt does not stop being salt because a barn falls on top of it. I had no meat either, except that there was a horse dead in the lane. One of Krell's, put down the night before with a broken foreleg and left where it dropped because nobody left alive in Rotbrook had the strength to drag it. I have broken down a great many things in a great many kitchens. I had never broken down a horse with a door hinge and a hand axe while a boy with a splint called the time down at me from a wall. I took the neck and the shanks and left the rest because I had 1 pot and no cold room. And taking more than you can hold is exactly how you turn food into rot and rot into sickness. Bones into the pot first. Cold water from the well, never hot, because hot water seals the bone, and what you get back is gray water with a smell. Fire under it. Skim the scum off the top with a flat stone. In went nettles, which grow anywhere a village keeps pigs, and which every starving person in Rotbrook had been walking past for a week without seeing. In went burdock root out of the ditch, chopped small. In went 6 handfuls of the hulled barley, washed twice. In went soot salt, and I tasted, and in went more, because under-seasoning is the only crime that cannot be corrected at the table. Mira Sedge came and stood over the pot, and said the ditch boy had never known how to do any of that. I told her the ditch boy was dead, and somebody considerably less holy had taken the room. She did not ask what I meant by that. That is something I learned about people who lose everything in one night. They have no strength left for strange questions, only for useful ones. She asked what she should tell the others. I said, tell them nobody eats this. She looked into the pot, and then at 17 starving people behind the barn wall, and then back at me. Because the smell was already out. That broth was pulling at the back of my own jaw like a hand, and I had eaten within living memory, which was more than anyone else on that ground could say. I said it again, slower. Nobody in this village puts 1 spoon of that in their mouth, and if they do, I will find out, and what happens after will be worse than being hungry. The smell went a great deal further than it had any right to go. Still air, damp morning, and that broth walked out over the ford and up the ridge road like it had an appointment. The page in the corner of my eye flickered and explained itself. It said, skill forming, aroma, the hungry will find you. It did not mention range. I found out about range later, on a much larger scale. Bort shouted from the wall. He shouted that there were men on the ridge road and that they were not walking anything like taxmen walk. I climbed up beside him with my ribs telling me precisely what they thought of ladders, and I looked north along the ridge road and I counted 3. 3 men coming down at the unhurried pace of men who have already decided a place belongs to them. One of them big enough to read as a shape rather than a person at that distance. 2 smaller, all 3 carrying steel. Mira Sedge gave me their names before I could ask. She said the big one was Dalm and the one in front was Gorse, and that they had come through 9 days ago, taken the last pig and cut a man's thumb off over it. The clock in the corner of my eye said 41 minutes. Then the page changed and said, enemy detected, Gorse, bandit marked. 2 more lines opened under it, for Pell and for Dalm. And then it said the thing that reorganized how I thought about everything afterward. It said, your strength grows with the strength of what wants you dead. I climbed down off the wall. I told Bort to get everyone behind the barn and to keep Wen somewhere she could not see the lane, and to keep her there no matter what she heard. Then I dragged the pot off the fire and out into the middle of the road, exactly where 3 armed men who had already taken a villager's thumb were going to walk, and I set out 1 bowl beside it. 1 bowl, not 3. That was deliberate, and it was the single most important thing I did that day, and I will get to why. I sat down next to the pot in the ash, unarmed, with 2 cracked ribs and a ladle. Behind me, 17 people who had not eaten in 4 days were being told to stay quiet and stay hungry while a stranger cooked for the men who had robbed them. Gorse came off the last of the ridge, stopped at the top of the lane, and looked down at the madman sitting in the road with a steaming pot. He started laughing before he was near enough for me to see his teeth, and he was still laughing when he stepped over my fire ring and looked into the broth. Gorse looked into the pot for a long moment, and then he asked me what a dead village was doing with a horse in it. And I told him it was his horse now, which was the first correct thing I said all day. He had a face that had been broken and reset badly at the nose. He wore a mail shirt that had belonged to somebody with wider shoulders. He carried a short blade with a wrapped grip that had been rewrapped many times. Pell was maybe 19, thin in the way that comes from choosing between food and drink for several years, and his eyes went to the pot and stayed there while Gorse was still talking. Dalm was enormous and slow, and did not look at the pot at all. He looked at the barn wall, and then at the ridge, and then at the barn wall again, which told me he was the only one of the 3 who was actually working. Gorse asked where the village had hidden the grain. I said the grain had been taken a week before he thought of it, by a man with better handwriting and more horses, and that he was late to his own robbery. He put the point of the short blade under my chin and lifted until I was looking at the sky. I could feel my pulse against the steel. That is not a figure of speech. You feel it in your jaw. I did not beg. I want to be clear that this was not courage. I had a clock in the corner of my eye that said 34 minutes, and begging was not on the list of things that would stop it. I said the broth was not for them. I said it was for men who could pay, and that the 3 of them had the look of men who had eaten nothing but stolen turnip for a fortnight, which is a very specific look, and I had it right. Pell said something to Gorse. Gorse told him to shut his mouth. The blade stayed where it was, but his eyes went sideways to the pot for the first time, and once they had gone there, once they went again. That is the whole trade. People think cooking is about heat and salt. Half of it is knowing that a man who has looked at a pot twice will look at it a 3rd time, and that the 3rd look is the one you sell. Gorse said it was poisoned. He said it in the flat way of a man announcing his own excuse for not eating something he badly wanted to eat. So I took the ladle, filled it, and drank the whole thing in front of him. Then I filled it again and offered it up to him from where I was sitting, which meant he had to reach down for it. That was the 2nd deliberate thing I did. A man who reaches down for food has already decided. Then there was the bowl. I had set out 1 wooden cup, not 3, and Gorse noticed and asked whether I thought he could not count. Here is why 1 cup. 3 bowls means 3 men taking as much as they want and leaving the bottom. Because leaving the bottom is how an armed man shows a beggar what he thinks of him. 1 cup means portions. 1 cup means a small measure, drunk down, handed back, filled again. 1 cup means every man in the line finishes what he is holding, because there is another man behind him waiting for the cup. I did not know the rules well enough yet to say it in those words. I knew it the way you know a service is about to go wrong, before anything has actually gone wrong. Gorse drank. He drank the way men drink when they are pretending not to be hungry, which involves a lot of stopping to say things. He stopped after 2 swallows to tell me it was thin. He drank again. He stopped to tell me it needed pepper. He drank again. Then he did not stop at all, and he tipped the cup up until the last of it came off the bottom of the wood, and he handed it back. The page in the corner of my eye said one word, bound, and Gorse's knees went out from under him in the middle of the road, in front of both of his own men. He did not go down the way a man goes down when he is hurt. He went down deliberately, both knees in the ash, mail shirt and all, and he set the blade on the ground beside him without being told, and waited. I have thought about that sound more than almost anything else in my life. The sound of a grown man's knees hitting the ground, and then nothing. No scream, no protest. Just a man waiting for instructions from somebody he had been about to gut. Pell backed up 3 steps and put his hand on his knife. Dolm did not move at all, because Dolm had already bent down and picked the cup up out of the ash. I want to say I stopped him. I did not stop him. I filled the cup, and I handed it up to a man twice my size, and I watched him drink it in 4 swallows and hand it back clean. Then Pell, who had watched both of them go down and still came forward, because he was 19 and starving, and the smell was in his hair by then. Pell finished his, and then did the thing that I have seen 100 times in kitchens, and never once forgotten. He ran 2 fingers around the inside of the cup and licked them. The page said 3, bound servants, 3, cook level 2, new skill unlocked, portioning, which shrinks a serving until an enemy can physically finish it. I did not understand what that would be worth for another month. The 3 of them knelt in the road in front of a pot, and one of them asked me in a completely ordinary voice where the wood was kept because he wanted to know where to start. I did not answer. I sat there with a ladle in my hand and my heart going like a bird in a box, and I understood that I had just done something enormous and I did not yet know what. So I tested it, and I am not proud of the test. I told Gorse to put his hand flat on the hearthstone, which had held a fire under it less than an hour before. He did it immediately, without a flicker, without asking why, and he laid his palm down on stone that was still hot enough to spit on, and he did not pull it away. I got his wrist and dragged his hand off the stone and shouted at him, and he apologized to me for being slow and asked whether he had done it wrong. That was the worst minute of that entire year, and there were some very bad minutes later on. Whatever I had won, it was not obedience. Obedience is a man choosing. This was something underneath choosing. Mira Sedge had come out from behind the barn wall while I was not looking, and she was standing at the edge of the road with her broom, watching the man who had cut off Wilm Terry's thumb kneel in the ash and ask about firewood. She asked me if it was going to wear off. I said I did not know. She asked if it hurt them. I said I did not know that either. She said, then, you had better learn fast, boy, because there are 3 of them today, and you have the look of somebody who is not going to stop at 3. Wen was there too. She had come around the barn wall in spite of Bort, and she was looking at Pell, and Pell was looking at the ground. She asked, in the flat voice children use when they have decided to be brave about something, whether the man was going to take another pig. Pell said no. He did not look up when he said it. There was no fight in the way he said it, and there was no lie in it either, and that was somehow much worse. The page opened wider than it had before, and it began counting things I had not asked it to count. It said, bound servant, Gorse. Former gate guard, 3rd Company, Ostvale, deserted, skill, watch discipline, assigned to territory as defense. It said, bound servant Pell, poacher, 6 years on the Grayfen Commons, skill, snare lines, and quiet ground, assigned to territory as forage. It said, bound servant Dolm, woodcutter, 12 years in the Northern Cut, skill, timber, and haulage, assigned to territory as labor and building. Every one of them came with a trade. That was the part I had not seen coming. The system did not just take a man's will. It counted his working life and put it on my books as a resource. I had woken up that morning with 2 cracked ribs and 11 eggs, and by noon I had a watchman, a hunter, and a woodcutter, and all 3 of them had arrived carrying knives meant for my throat. Territory rank Ashground. Progress toward Hamlet. 3 bound of 9 required. Second condition, 1 roof structure standing. 9 bound, 1 roof. That was the first bottleneck the system ever handed me, and it was a good one because it told me exactly what I was short of without telling me how to get it. Pell went out with nothing but a coil of cord off Dolm's pack and came back inside 2 hours with 4 hares and a description of every rabbit run within a mile of the ford. Dolm walked to the tree line and started dropping timber, alone, at a rate that made me stop what I was doing and watch, because I had never seen a man work like that outside of a story. Gorse walked the perimeter of the village twice, then came and told me that the ford was the only good crossing for 4 miles, that the ridge road overlooked us the whole way in, and that whoever built Rotbrook had been an idiot. Then he told me that we could not hold it with 3 men, and that the north approach needed eyes at all times, and I realized I was being briefed. And then Pell laid 4 hares down by my fire, and I could not cook a single one of them. That is the thing I had been walking toward all day and refusing to look at directly. The hares were food. The village was starving. The fire would not light for the village. I tried anyway, because a man has to see it fail with his own hands before he believes it. Dry kindling, still air, 9 strikes, 9 dead sparks. Wen was standing about 10 feet away, and that was all it took. Mira Sedge asked me what was wrong with the flint. I told her there was nothing wrong with the flint. Then I stood there in the middle of a dead village holding 4 hares I could not turn into dinner. And Gorse said in the flat, helpful voice that still made the back of my neck crawl that he could cook. I turned around very slowly and asked him what he had just said to me. He said he had done 4 years of camp cooking in the 3rd company at Ostvale, and that it was mostly boiling, and that he could boil a hare if somebody told him to. The rule said I could not cook for a friend. It said nothing whatsoever about what my bound men were allowed to do with their own 2 hands. I gave him the pot. I stood at his shoulder, and I taught him the way I have taught every commiss I ever had, which is by making them do it while I say the same 4 things over and over. Cold water, skim it, salt it now, not at the end. Do not let it boil hard, because hard boiling makes the meat tight and the broth cloudy, and we cannot afford cloudy. The fire caught on the first strike. It was not my fire anymore. That was the entire difference, and the entire difference was enough. An hour later, there were 17 people sitting on hearthstones in a burned village with hot food in front of them, and the man serving it was the man who had taken their last pig. Nobody said anything. Nobody thanked him. Hessalum, who had lost her husband to the torches 4 days earlier, took the bowl out of Gorse's hands without looking at his face, and that was as close to peace as that evening got. Wen would not take hers. She stood there with her arms down at her sides and would not put her hands out, and Pell held the bowl and waited. And neither of them moved for what felt like a very long time. Then Mira Sedge said quietly that the pig was gone either way, that a hungry child was not payment for it, and that if Wen wanted to hate the man, she could do it perfectly well on a full stomach. Wen ate. She ate the whole thing, and then she held the bowl out for the rest of the broth at the bottom of the pot, and she drank that too. And then she went and sat down against the barn wall and slept for 14 hours. I sat up all night on the barn wall next to Gorse because I did not trust the world enough to sleep, and somewhere around the middle of it, he told me 2 things without being asked. The first was that Krell would be back. Tax officers count survivors, and then they come back and take a head tax on the ones still standing, and Krell had written 17 in a ledger for a reason. He said 11 days. The reckoning at Greyfen falls 11 days from that morning, and if the coin is short, the officer takes it out of whatever is left standing. The second thing was worse. Gorse said that he and Pell and Dolm had been the forward party, and that there were 9 more men camped a day and a half north under a man called Rook, and that Rook did not lose people quietly. I asked him what Rook would do when 3 of his men did not come back. Gorse said Rook would come and look, and that when he found them alive and working for somebody else, he would burn the ford, the barn, and the well, in that order. I sat on that wall with a ladle across my knees and a clock in my head, and I did the arithmetic that I would keep doing for the next year. 9 bound and 1 roof to reach Hamlet. 11 days until a tax officer came back to count us. A day and a half of road between me and 9 armed men who were going to arrive very angry. And every single one of those problems was technically a delivery of ingredients walking toward me on its own 2 legs. 9 armed men, furious, arriving on their own. I fell asleep on that wall smiling, and the smile frightened me more than Rook did. By the 3rd morning, I had 20 mouths and 4 hares, and the arithmetic of that is not complicated. 4 hares is 1 good meal for 20 people, or 4 thin meals, or 12 meals that make everyone weaker while pretending not to. Pell's snare lines were good, but they were not magic. You can strip the rabbit runs around a ford in about 6 days, and after that you have taught every rabbit in the district to live somewhere else. Dolm could drop timber all day, and timber is not food. Gorse could boil what he was given, and boiling nothing produces hot water with opinions. So on the 3rd morning I stopped looking at what Rotbrook had, and started looking at what Rotbrook had thrown away, which is where I have found every good idea I have ever had. The granary had burned on the first night. Everyone in the village had walked past it for 4 days and called it ash, and nobody had put a hand into it. Here is a thing that most people do not know, and that not one person in that village knew, because nobody in a farming village has ever had a reason to find it out. Grain does not burn the way straw burns. A packed grain heap chars on the outside and cooks on the inside. The fire seals the crust, and the middle roasts in its own moisture. And roasted grain keeps better than raw grain does. I put my arm into the granary heap up to the shoulder and pulled out a fistful from the middle of it. And it was warm, and it was brown, and it smelled like the back of a bakery. Mira Sedge came over and looked at my hand and said, "That was burned." I said it was parched, which is a different word for a very different thing, and I bit one and chewed it in front of her. It tasted like toast. It tasted better than the barley we had been eating, because heat had done to it what heat does, and this village had been standing on top of a month of food while starving. We dug the granary out with boards. Under about a foot of genuine ash and clinker, there was a body of parched barley the size of a hay cart, and about a third of it was good. Mira Sedge sat down in the middle of the granary floor with a handful of it and did not say anything for a while. And then she said her husband had built that roof, and that was all she said. The page in the corner of my eye opened and gave me something for it. It said, "Skill forming, cook from nothing. Value is recognized where others see waste. That skill is the reason I am alive." Everything else the kitchen ever gave me came with a rule and a cost. That one just made me better at seeing. Under Cook from Nothing, the burned village stopped being a ruin and started being a larder that needed sorting, and I went through it the way I would go through a walk-in cooler on a Monday morning. The Ford had cattail beds. Cattail root is starch, and starch is what a hungry body screams for. You wash it, crush it, settle the flour out of the water, and you have something you can thicken a pot with. The oak stand on the ridge had 2 years of acorns rotting underneath it. Acorn is bitter enough to make a man gag, but bitterness leaches. 3 changes of water, a day and a night, and you have flour. There were bones everywhere. Every household in Rotbrook had a midden with bones in it, and every bone in every midden still had marrow, gelatin, and mineral in it that nobody had ever taken out. I set Bort and the older children to a bone pit. Break them, boil them long, skim, boil them again. It is slow, dull, hot work, and it turns rubbish into the difference between thin and thick. Hessaloom watched me splitting a shank bone with a stone and asked why anyone would want the inside of a bone. I told her that the inside of a bone is why an animal can stand up, and that we could use some standing up. By the 4th day, the pot in the square was not thin anymore. Parched barley, acorn flour, cattail starch, bone stock, nettle, and salt out of a burned barn. Gorse cooked it because I could not. That never stopped being strange. I stood at his elbow and told him when to skim, and he skimmed, and 20 people ate food I had designed and could not touch. Wen took the ladle. Nobody appointed her. She simply arrived at the pot on the 4th morning and put her hand out for it. And Gorse, who had killed people, handed a ladle to a 9-year-old and stepped back. She served in an order she made up herself, and the order was children, then the sick, then the workers, then the bound men, then me. I did not argue with it. Neither did anyone else, then or ever. And while all that was happening, my own counter had not moved. Bound servants, 3. Cook level 2. Because none of it was cooking. All of it was teaching. And the kitchen does not pay for teaching. The kitchen pays for enemies. And on the 5th day, 2 of them came down the ridge road at a walk, looking for 3 men who had not come back. Gorse saw them first, and named them before they were close. 2 of rooks, one called Mech, and one whose name he did not know, both carrying bows, both moving off the road and along the ditch line, which is not how you walk when you want to talk. I sent everyone behind the barn. Then I did the thing that I would end up doing in one form or another for the rest of my life. I put a pot on the road and sat down behind it. Mech came in shouting. He wanted Gorse. He said Rook had counted 3 men missing, and that Rook had a way of settling a count. And while he was saying it, he was looking at Gorse, standing at my shoulder with a ladle. That was the moment the world got strange for him, and I watched it happen on his face. His own man, alive, unhurt, well-fed, standing behind a stranger holding kitchen tools. He asked Gorse what had been done to him. Gorse said he had been fed. Mech laughed at that and then stopped laughing because Gorse had not laughed with him. The second man never came out of the ditch. He stayed down in the grass with his bow across his knees, and that detail is important, and I did not see it in time. I offered Mech the cup. He said he would not eat from a dead village. I said the dead village had better food than Rook's camp, which was a guess, and it landed. Because his face moved. Then I use portioning for the first time, and I want to be accurate about what it does, because half the empire got it wrong later. It does not create food. It takes what is in the cup and reduces it in volume, without taking anything out of it. A full bowl becomes 3 swallows. The taste is not diluted, it is concentrated, because everything that was there is still there. So I handed a man who had just refused a meal an amount of soup that looked like nothing. 3 swallows. A rude amount, an insulting amount, honestly, and that is exactly what made him take it. He drank it to make a point. He tipped it back to show me what he thought of my hospitality, and he swallowed all 3 swallows because 3 swallows is not enough to leave any of. Bound. 4. Mek went down on his knees in the middle of the road, and out in the ditch line, his partner stood up out of the grass, and I saw a bow come up over the top of it. I got behind the pot. The arrow went through the space where my shoulder had been, and stuck in the barn wall behind me, at a height that would have gone through my throat. That is the closest I came to dying in the first month, and it was not from a man with a sword. It was from a man who had watched his friend eat. He ran. He did not shoot again. He went back up the ditch line and over the ridge, and Pell went after him, and lost him in the oak stand, and came back and told me so, flatly, the way bound men tell you things. I found out afterward what he carried north with him because I ended up owning the man who heard it. He walked into Rook's camp and reported that Gorse was alive, fat, and holding a ladle for a beggar in a burned village. Rook took that as a joke for about a day and a half. Then he counted the men he had lost to a place with no walls, no gate, and no weapons, and he stopped treating it as a joke and started treating it as a wound. He told his people that whatever was in Rotbrook had to be burned down to the wellstones before the story got as far as the next valley. He was right about that, and he was 5 days too late. And he did not know either thing yet. And here is the distinction that cost me a great deal later. That man was still my enemy. He had not eaten one mouthful. He had not left one crumb. He had simply refused, and refusing leaves the door open. Leaving food is the only thing that closes it. I did not fully understand that yet. I understood it 8 days later, in a way I have never stopped thinking about. Mek came with a trade like the others did. The page said, bound servant, Mek, Fletcher, 4 years apprenticed at Grayfin, skill, arrow making and bow repair, assigned to territory as defense. A Fletcher. I had a Fletcher, a woodcutter, a poacher, and a gate guard, and I had not paid a copper for any of them, and every one of them had arrived with the intention of killing me. That afternoon, Mek cut and fletched 40 arrows out of ash wood and goose feather he pulled off the midden, and Gorse put them in a barrel by the ford, and Rotbrook had a weapon it had not had that morning. Then, on the 6th day, the crows came. Not birds. Crow was what the district called men like Tatch, and the district said the word the way you say the name of a disease. Tatch stripped burned villages. That was his trade, and it was a trade in the sense that he had tools for it and knew which houses to open first. He came in with 3 grown sons and 2 carts. He was not surprised to find people alive. He said so. He said the living ones usually let him take what he wanted because the living ones were too weak to stop him, and that we looked about right for it. The page marked all 4 of them the instant he said it. Enemy, Tatch, enemy, and 3 more lines under it. So I did not put out a pot for Tatch. I put out bread. Because that morning, I had used the other thing the kitchen had given me, and I had used it on him before he finished his sentence. The page called it tasting. What it does is show you what a man has not eaten since he was a child. Over Tatch's head, it said 2 words and a number. Wheat bread, not since he was 10 years old, which meant that somewhere behind that cart there was a childhood that had ended badly. So while his sons were breaking into the alehouse ruin, I took parched barley and acorn flour and cattail starch, and I made something that was not wheat bread, because there was no wheat standing anywhere in that district. But I know what wheat bread is for. It is soft, it is warm, it smells of the inside of an oven, and it is the food that tells a person somebody has a home and they are inside it. I baked flat cakes on a hot stone with a little of the horse fat, and I turned them until they blistered, and the smell came up off that stone and went out across a burned village at the exact moment Tatch walked back out of the alehouse with a chair in his hands. He stopped where he stood. His sons kept walking, and he did not. He put the chair down. He came over to the stone and stood there and did not say anything for a while. And then he asked me, in a voice that had gone completely wrong, where I had got wheat. I said it was not wheat, and that there was no wheat standing within 9 miles of that ford. He said it did not matter, and he put his hand out for another one. He ate 4 of them standing up, and he did not leave a corner of any of them. And his sons came over and ate the rest because their father was eating. And by the time the smoke cleared, I had 9 bound and 2 carts. Bound servants 9, cook level 3. And then the page did something it had not done before. It said, territory conditions met, 9 bound, 1 roofed structure. Rank advanced, ash ground to Hamlet. Dolm had put a roof back on the barn that morning. He had done it in a day and a half alone, because nobody had told him to stop, and I had not even walked over to look at it. The reward came up out of the ground in the square. That is the only way I can describe it. Stone came up through ash and set itself into a hearth about the size of a cart bed, with a chimney of fitted stone, and the fire in it was already burning. The page said, "Standing hearth, granted at Hamlet rank. It does not go out. Aroma doubled. Bound servants may cook at it in your name." Mira Sedge put her hand flat on the stone of it and asked me if it was safe. I said I had no idea. She left her hand there anyway, because it was warm, and she was 70, and it was the first warm thing in Rotbrook since the fire. 26 people ate at that hearth that night, 17 villagers and 9 men who had come to rob or kill them, and the 9 did the cooking and the carrying and the washing, and Wen decided the order of the line. I sat on a stone at the edge of it, and watched a burned village eat hot food, and I let myself feel good about it for about the length of one bowl. Then, Bort called down from the barn roof, and I climbed up, and there was a single rider on the ridge road, at dusk, stopped, not coming down. He sat there long enough to count. Then he turned his horse and went back north at a trot, and Gorse said what I already knew, which was that tax officers send a man ahead to see whether the number in the ledger still matches. Mira Sedge had started keeping a tally that night, scratched into a board with a nail, because she said a village that does not count itself gets counted by somebody else. 26 names, 9 of them under a line, and she would not tell me what the line meant. 6 days to the reckoning, 26 people, no coin, and a man who had already burned this village once now knew that it was standing up again. Ruck was a day and a half north and coming. Krell turned out to be a great deal closer than 6 days, and the only thing I could do about either of them was set a table. Sabin Krell came back on the 7th day at 9 in the morning, with 6 riders, a clerk on a mule, and a leather case with a strap worn shiny by 20 years of the same shoulder. I had spent 6 days getting ready for a man with a sword. I got a man with a case, and the case turned out to be worse, and it took me most of that morning to understand why. He came down the lane at a walk, and he did not look at the people at all. He looked at the roof. Dolm's new roof on the barn. He stopped his horse under it, tipped his head back, and started counting the beams out loud while his clerk wrote. Then he rode to the square and looked at the standing hearth, at the stone chimney with smoke coming out of it, and I watched something happen on his face that I had been completely unprepared for. He was pleased, not surprised, not frightened by a stone hearth that had not existed a week earlier. Pleased, the way a man is pleased to find that a debt he had written off is walking around with money in its pocket. He said to the clerk, and not to me, that Rotbrook was to be reassessed. Roofed holding, 1. Permanent hearth, 1. Standing labor, visible, considerable. Here is what I learned in the next 10 minutes, and it is the single most useful thing anyone in this world ever taught me by accident. A tax officer does not punish you for being poor. Poor is cheap and predictable and already written down. A tax officer punishes you for improving, and he does it with a straight face and a very sharp pen. Every beam Dalm had put up had raised our assessment. Every stone in that hearth had raised it. The carts Tatch had brought in were now taxable movable property, and the clerk wrote them down without dismounting. The old assessment had been 17 head at the pauper rate, which the fire had already collected. The new one was a roofed holding with a hearth, 2 carts, and 26 mouths, and it came to more coin than Rotbrook had held in its entire history. I asked him what happened if we could not pay. He answered me directly for the first time, and he was polite about it, which was somehow the worst part. He said the arrears would be taken in kind. Movable property first, then labor. Labor meant bodies, and bodies meant that he would name 6 people and take them south to the quarry at Grayfen, and that they would work the difference off. Mirasej asked how long 6 people would need to work it off. Krell did the arithmetic properly without hurrying, and said 9 years. He said it the way you say a Tuesday. I want to describe him properly, because for the rest of this story, he is the man standing behind everything, and it matters that he was not a monster. He was worse than a monster. He was correct. He was about 50, gray at the sides, ink on the second finger of his right hand and nowhere else, which means a man who has held a pen for 30 years and never once dropped it. Boots resoled, not replaced. He was not stealing. He was collecting. He had burned Rotbrook because the schedule said arrears could be collected in fire when the store was short, and the store had been short. He had written 17 in the ledger because 17 was true. He would take 6 people to a quarry for 9 years because the column said so, and he would sleep well, and if you asked him whether he was cruel, he would not understand the question. My whole plan for that morning had been extremely simple. and I had been proud of it for 2 days. Feed him. Feed the man in the gray coat, and the problem stops being a problem forever. I had the standing hearth. I had portioning. I had 9 bound men who could carry, serve, and clear. I had spent 2 days building a menu for one middle-aged man who eats at inns and has not tasted anything worth remembering in a decade. And the page in the corner of my eye said nothing at all. No mark. No enemy line. Nothing over his head but the ordinary empty air that hangs over a stranger. I stood in my own square with everything ready, and the fire would not light because Sabin Krell did not hate me. He did not hate anybody. Hating people takes time a man of his habits does not have. That is the trap in the rule that took me a week to see. Being hurt by a man does not make him your enemy. He has to be your enemy. It has to be personal, and it has to run in his direction, not only in yours. To Krell, I was not a person. I was a line. He had burned my village the way you cross out a column, and you do not hate a column. So the pot sat cold in front of the biggest opportunity I had ever had, and 6 riders started walking through the houses, picking out who was strong enough for a quarry. The captain of the escort was a broad man named Pharaoh who did the picking. He took Hesaloom by the wrist because she had a weaver's forearms. He took Bort because 12 is old enough for a quarry in Grayfen. Wen went at him. She was 9, and she weighed about as much as a full bucket, and she went straight at a man in mail with both hands. Pharaoh put his palm flat on her chest and shoved, and she went down backward onto the hearthstones, and the sound her head made on stone is a sound I still hear. The page lit up like somebody had struck a match behind my eyes. Enemy detected, Pharaoh. Enemy detected, and 5 lines under it, 1 for every rider who laughed. The fire caught before I touched a flint. I did not shout at Pharaoh. I did not go for him. I went to the hearth and I filled 6 cups, and I used portioning until each one held about 4 swallows, and I carried them over on a board myself. He asked me what that was supposed to be. I said it was what the village owed the escort, and that we would not want it recorded that Rotbrook fed the officer and not his men. That sentence did the work. 6 men who had been ignored at every stop for 6 years took a cup each, because being fed in front of the man who does not feed you is worth more than the food. They drank standing, in mail, holding the reins, and they drank it fast to show me it was nothing. 4 swallows is not enough to leave any of. It has never once been enough. Pharaoh's cup went down out of his hand into the ash. Then 5 more. 6 men in the Baron's colors went down on their knees around a hearth in a village they had come to strip. The horses did not like it. That is the detail I remember best. They started stepping sideways because their riders had all let go of everything at the same moment. Bound servants, 15, cook level 4. Pharaoh came with a line I did not expect. Escort captain, 12 years. Skill, road discipline, and prisoner handling. Assigned to territory as defense. The man who had shoved Wen onto the stones was now, on my books, the thing that would keep her from being shoved. Hesaloom got Wen up off the stones. There was blood in her hair at the back, and she was furious rather than frightened. And the first thing she said, before anything else, was that the pot was going to boil over. I would hand that sentence to anybody who wants to understand what that village had become in 7 days. A grown man had put a child on the ground, and the child's first thought was the pot. I turned to look at Krell and found out exactly what kind of man I was dealing with, because Sabin Krell had not moved, had not drawn, and had not shouted. He had opened his case. He was writing. He asked me, without looking up, whether the effect was permanent. I said I did not know. He asked whether it required the food to be prepared by my own hand. I said yes. He asked whether the subject had to consume the entire portion. I did not answer that one. He wrote something anyway, and I have thought a great deal about what he wrote. And I am fairly sure that on the 7th day, in my own square, with 6 of his men on their knees, Sabin Krell worked out the counter to me, and I stood there and let him do it. Then he closed the case and made me an offer, and it was a good offer. And that is the part nobody believes when I tell it afterward. The man I had just robbed of 6 soldiers offered me a job. He said the barony of Grayfen had enemies. He said the crown had more. He said a man with my ability was worth a household, a stipend, and a title inside 3 years, and that all of it was available to me that morning if I got on a horse. He said I could take the girl. He said it in the same voice, as an item on a list, and I think he genuinely believed he was being generous. I asked what happened to Rotbrook. He said Rotbrook would be cleared and the land put back to grain, because a burned village on good bottom land is a waste, and the survivors would be settled where labor was short. So there it was. A household, a title, a stipend, and a girl. in exchange for a village of 26 people that he did not consider to be a place. And still no mark. He had offered to erase my home, and he was not my enemy because he was offering me a promotion while he did it. 6 of his men were kneeling in the ash, and he was negotiating. That is the moment I understood that Sabin Krell was going to be with me until one of us was finished. So I made him hate me. On purpose. Out loud. In front of his own clerk. I want to be honest that I enjoyed it, and that enjoying it was the beginning of a habit that nearly cost me everything 2 years later. I asked to see the ledger. He handed it to me because a man like that is proud of his work and because I had asked politely. I read the Rotbrook page out loud to the whole square. The date, the arrears, the line that said collection completed by fire, the number 17. Then I told him, in front of a clerk who wrote it down because writing things down was the whole of his job, that the number 17 was wrong and that I could prove it. I said there had been 19 people in Rotbrook on the morning he wrote out, because 2 of them were alive under the barn timbers and died the next day, and that he had not counted them because he had not walked the barn. I said his ledger recorded a collection that was short by 2 heads, and that a tax officer whose column does not balance has not collected anything. He has taken it. The clerk stopped writing. That was how I knew it had landed. A clerk stops writing when the sentence is too dangerous to have in his hand. Krell said quietly that I should give him the book, and I dropped it in the pot. It went in flat, and it went under, and the broth closed over it, and 20 years of a man's handwriting started coming off the pages in gray threads. The page in the corner of my eye lit and stayed lit. Enemy detected. Sabin Krell, tax officer of Grayfen. Marked. The fire under the pot, which was already burning, went up about a foot on its own. Nobody in that square moved. Mira Sedge had both hands over her mouth. Farrell was still on his knees. The clerk was looking at the mule as though he wanted to be on it. And Sabin Krell stood there with his empty hands and looked at me, and he did not shout, and he did not reach for anything. And that was when I got my first proper look at the man underneath the schedule. He said, in a completely level voice, that he had held that book for 22 years, and that his father had held the one before it. Then he brushed the ash off his sleeve with 2 fingers. Then he said the thing I have never been able to get out of my head. He said that he would eat at my table before the year was out, and that I should think very carefully about whether that was what I wanted. I did not think carefully. I was 26 years old in a body that was not mine. I had 15 bound servants, a hearth that would not go out, and the man who burned my village had just been marked as my enemy, in letters of light. I told him dinner would be ready at dusk. He said dusk would do. Then he sent his clerk back to Grayfen on the mule, alone, with a written order I did not get to read, and he sat down on the edge of the well to wait. He waited 8 hours. He did not eat, he did not drink from the well, and he did not speak to a single one of the 6 men who had ridden in with him and were now carrying water for me. Tatch asked me why I had not simply had the 6 kneeling men take him. It was a fair question, and I gave him the true answer, which is that a bound man will kill for you, and I did not want to find out how easily I could ask. Mira Sedge gave me a different answer to the same question later, and hers was better. She said a man who murders a tax officer has a dead officer. A man who feeds one has a tax officer. I sharpened everything I owned that afternoon, which was 1 hand axe and a broken hinge, and I thought about the questions Krell had asked me and the order he had sent away on a mule. Because that is the part I did not weigh properly. The clerk left at 10 in the morning with a folded page and a wax seal, riding for Grayfen, and I let him go because I was busy being pleased with myself. That page reached Baron Orvin Merrick 4 days later, and it did not say that a village had risen up. It said that a low-born cook at Rotbrook was taking the Baron's soldiers off the Baron's roll, 1 cup at a time. And out on the North Ridge, while I was building the best meal of my life for a man in a gray coat, Gorse counted 14 fires where there had been one, and came and told me that Rook had moved his camp 2 hours closer. I have cooked 1 meal in my life that I would call finished, and I cooked it for a man who burned a village with 17 people in it, and he beat me with a spoon and a bean. The tasting page opened over Sabin Krell the moment he was marked, and it gave me more than it had ever given me before, because a man who has held one job for 22 years has a very long list of things he stopped eating. It said, white beans and pork fat, with thyme and a scrape of garlic, thickened with the crust of yesterday's bread, not since he was 9 years old. Under that, it gave me the reason, which it had never done for anybody else, and which I still think it did because the reason was written all over the man. It said, the woman who made it died in the winter of the short harvest, and nobody in that house cooked again. So, I had 8 hours, a burned village, and a dish that needed white beans, pork fat, thyme, garlic, and old bread in a place that had none of those 5 things. Pell brought me beans, not white ones. He went out along the ditch banks and came back with 2 double handfuls of dried field beans out of a broken storehouse in a farmstead that had been empty for a year, and about a third of them were sound. Pork fat came from a hare. That is not a substitution, it is a lie, and I knew it while I was doing it. But rendered hare fat with a little of the horse marrow in it comes closer than you would think, and closer was all I had. Thyme grows on the ridge above every village in this district, and Wen knew exactly where, because she had spent 2 summers being sent up there to pick it, and she brought me back more than I needed because she did not know how much I needed. There was no garlic. There were ramson bulbs in the oak stand, dug out of the leaf mold, which are wilder and sharper and wrong. I roasted them whole in the ash for an hour until they went sweet and stopped shouting, and after that, they were close enough to walk past. Old bread I made myself. I baked flat cakes on the hearthstone in the morning and left them out in the wind all afternoon until they went hard, because a fresh crust dissolves and a stale one holds, and that dish needs something in it that holds. I put the beans on at noon, and I did not let them boil once. Beans that boil break, and broken beans make paste. And the whole point of that dish is that every bean stays a bean, and you meet each one separately. I sat by that pot for 6 hours, moving the coals in and out to hold it just under a simmer. Gorse offered 3 times to watch it. I would not let him. It was the only thing in that village I was allowed to do with my own hands, and I was not sharing it. Faro, who had put Wen on the stones that morning, spent the afternoon carrying water for the pot, meant to catch his own officer, and did not find it strange. I made myself watch him do it, because I did not want to get comfortable with it. At dusk, we put a board across 2 barrels in the square, and 1 stool, and 1 bowl, and 1 spoon that Mech had cut out of ashwood that afternoon, because there was not a whole spoon left in Rotbrook. Sabin Krell got up off the well edge, brushed his coat, sat down at my table, and put both hands flat on the board on either side of the bowl, the way a man sits down to a meal in a house where he was raised properly. The whole village watched. 26 people. 6 of them, his own men. Nobody made a sound. Wen was standing at my hip with both hands full of my sleeve, and I did not notice until afterward that my arm had gone numb. He looked into the bowl for a long time without touching the spoon. Then he asked me very quietly who had told me. It was not a threat. It was a man asking about a locked room. I said, nobody had told me. He said that was not possible, and he said it quietly, and his voice was not level for the first time since he had ridden in. He ate the first spoonful and put the spoon down and sat back and did not move for about the length of 10 breaths. His eyes were open. He was not looking at anything in the square. I have put a lot of plates down in front of a lot of people. That is the only time I have ever watched a man go somewhere else entirely and come back and be a slightly different shape than he was when he left. Then he ate the rest of it, properly, at the pace of a man who has decided to pay attention. And he took the crust off the side and used it to get the fat off the bottom, and he made a sound in his throat once, and pretended he had not. He ate for 11 minutes by the watchfire. There were perhaps 4 mouthfuls left in the bowl, then 3, then 2, and the square was so quiet I could hear the well rope moving in the wind. I stopped breathing somewhere around 2, and I want to record that I was already writing the next year of my life in my head. Krell bound, Grafen open, the baronies roll in my hands by winter, the quarry emptied, Wen safe forever. He took the second last spoonful. He set the spoon down on the board. He picked the bowl up, tipped it, and looked into the bottom of it the way you look into a cup for grounds. Then he took the spoon back up, went into the bottom of the bowl, and lifted out 1 bean. He put it on the rim. He set the spoon down beside it and folded his hands. 1 bean, on the edge of a wooden bowl, on a board across 2 barrels, with the light of the standing hearth sitting on it like it had been placed there for me to look at. The page in the corner of my eye did not congratulate me, and it did not warn me. It simply corrected the record. In the flat way, it corrected everything. It said, portion not completed. Binding failed. Sabin Krell remains an enemy. Sabin Krell can no longer be bound by your cooking. Permanent. Permanent. That is the only word in this entire story that the kitchen ever used twice in 1 line, and it used it because it wanted me to understand that there was no route back. Krell said, without 1 grain of triumph in it, that the beans had been very good, and that the ramson in place of garlic was a better choice than garlic would have been. Then he explained himself, and he did it patiently, the way he did everything, because he was not gloating. He was filing a report, and I happened to be standing where the report was going. He said he had asked me 3 questions that morning: whether the effect was permanent, whether the food had to be made by my hand, whether the subject had to consume the whole portion. He said I had answered the first 2 and refused the third, and that a man only refuses the question whose answer would cost him. He had ridden nowhere and waited 8 hours because he already knew what he was going to do at the end of the meal. He said the difficulty was not the rule, the difficulty was the meal. He said he had not expected to have to fight to leave 1 bean, and that he had come very close to failing, and that he wanted me to know that. I asked him why he had eaten any of it at all, when he could have refused the bowl and lost nothing. He said because he wanted to. He said it flatly, and I believe it, and it is the only unguarded thing that man ever said to me. Then he stood up, and he became the schedule again. He said the assessment stood. He said the arrears were due. He said he was riding to Grayfen, and that he would report a village in open defiance, holding 6 of the Baron's soldiers under an unnatural compulsion. And then he told me the thing that turned 1 bean into the shape of the next 2 years. He said the counter was cheap. He said any fool could be taught it in a sentence. He said it out loud, in my square, in front of my people, so that it could not be unsaid. Do not finish the plate. Leave a crumb. Leave a bone. Leave 1 bean, and the cook has nothing. He got on his horse. 6 men who had ridden in with him stood in a line by my hearth and watched him go and did not move, and he did not look at any of them. Pharaoh was the one who broke first, and it was not loud. He stood there in the Baron's colors with a water yoke still across his shoulders and asked me, quite politely, whether he should go after the officer and bring him back. I said no. He said very well and went and put the yoke down and started stacking wood, and that was the whole of it. And somehow that was worse than if he had wept. Wen picked the bowl up. I told her to leave it. She said she was only going to wash it, and then she stood there holding it with the beans still on the rim, and did not wash it. And after a while she put it back down exactly where it had been. She asked me whether he had done it on purpose. I said yes. She asked whether that meant he had liked it. I said yes, and she thought about that for a long moment, and said that was the meanest thing she had ever heard of. I sat down on the stool he had been sitting on. The bowl was still there. The bean was still on the rim. It sat there for 4 days because nobody would touch it and nobody would tell me to. Mira Sedge came over after a while with her board and her nail, and she scratched a line at the bottom, and under the line she wrote 1 word: Krell. I asked her what the line was for. She said she had put it there the night I fed Tatch, because she had watched me count 9 bound men, and she had known, the way old people know, that sooner or later there was going to be a second column. She said the top of the board was what I had won, and the bottom was what I could never win again, and that I should look at the bottom of the board more often than the top, because the bottom was the only part that never came off. She called it the leftover ledger. She named it herself that night with 1 name on it, and by the end of all this, there were 241. I sat with that. I want to be honest about how badly it went for a few hours, because everything after this reads like a man winning, and I did not feel like a man winning. The kitchen gave me nothing for the failure. No skill, no lesson, no consolation line. That was the worst part. It rewards enemies eaten, and it does not acknowledge enemies lost, and I had to work the lesson out myself, sitting on a stool, looking at a bean. Here is what I worked out that night, sitting on his stool with his bowl in front of me, and it is the single reason I am not dead in a ditch outside Grayfen. I had served him a bowl with things in it that could be counted. Beans are countable. A man who intends to leave something can always leave one of a countable thing, and he can do it late after he has already enjoyed the whole meal. So from that night, I stopped serving anything countable to a man with time to think. Broth, not stew. Puree, not pieces. A cup, not a plate. 1 measured mouthful, handed over while a man is proud or angry or thirsty and not counting. If a man can count what is in front of him, he can keep one. If he cannot count it, he has to decide to stop. And stopping is much harder than saving. That single rule took me from 15 bound to 2,000, and Sabin Krell handed it to me himself for the price of 1 bean, and I have never decided which of us paid more for that dinner. Krell rode 2 hours that night and stopped at a wayhouse on the Grayfen Road, and I know exactly what he did there, because 2 years later, the man who served him told me while wiping down my own counter. He asked for paper. He wrote until the candle went out, and then he asked for another candle. He was not writing a report to the Baron. That took him 9 lines. The rest of the night went on a set of instructions. 6 rules for eating at the cook's table. He had them copied and sent to every officer of the Grayfen assessment before he slept. That is the man. He lost a soldier, a ledger, and a village in 1 day, and he answered with a training document. I got up. I told Gorse to double the ridge watch. I told Mech how many arrows I wanted by morning, and he said the number was not possible, and then went and did about 2/3 of it. I told Wen to sleep inside the barn from now on, with the other children, and not by the hearth. She asked why. I said because I had made an enemy who could not be fed, and there was going to be more of that. And at some point in the middle of the second watch, Bort came off the barn roof so fast that he fell the last 6 feet, and he could not get the words out for a moment, and then he got them out. Torches on the north ridge, not 1, not 3. A line of them coming down the ridge road at a run, spread wide the way men spread when they are not planning to talk first. Gorse counted them off the wall in the dark and gave me the number in the same flat voice he used for firewood and weather, which is a thing about bound men that never stopped being useful and never stopped being awful. 22. Rook had not brought 9. He had gone and collected every man who owed him anything within a day's ride, because a story about a village that eats bandits had gone further and faster than I had. 22 men, at night, against a hamlet with 1 wall, 9 bound fighters, 6 new ones who had never held a line together, and a cook who could not light a fire for anybody who was not trying to kill him. I stood on the barn roof with a ladle through my belt, like an idiot, with my ribs still not knitted, and I did the only calculation that was available to me. 22 enemies, marked, every one of them, the second they came off the ridge, which meant that the largest raiding party in the district had just walked onto my ground, carrying the only ingredient I was allowed to use. 22 men came down the ridge road at a run, and the first thing I learned about my own power that night is that a man charging in the dark does not stop to be offered soup. Aroma is a beautiful thing when a hungry man has time. At a dead run, in the dark, with a torch in one hand, a man does not smell anything except his own sweat and the pitch on the torch. And that is the whole of it. So my one weapon was useless for the first hour of that night, and the hour had to be paid for by people who were physically incapable of telling me no. Gorse laid it out in about 40 seconds on the barn roof, and I have never in my life been so glad that a man I owned had spent 12 years on a gate. The ford is the only crossing for 4 miles. The banks above and below it are cut and soft, and a man in the dark who tries them goes in up to his chest and comes out slow. So everything comes through the ford, 12 feet wide, over stone. Faro took the ford with 4 of the Baron's men and a line of stakes that Dalm had cut that afternoon for a fence, and which became something else entirely. Mech went up on the barn roof with a bow and 20 arrows, and Pell went into the ditch line on the flank with a hatchet and no orders except to make noise from the wrong direction, which he was extraordinarily good at. And Dalm went to the gap. There is a place at the top of the lane where 2 burned houses fell into each other, and there is a hole in that wreck about the width of a cart, and if you get through it, you are behind the ford. I did not know it was there. Gorse knew. He said one man could hold it and asked me who I wanted there, and I said Dalm, because Dalm was the biggest, and that is exactly how much thought I put into it. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I have had a great many years to be imprecise about it, and I have refused. I said, Dalm, hold the gap. Dalm said yes. He picked up a felling axe, and he walked to the gap and he stood in it. He did not ask how long. He did not ask what happened if they came in numbers. He did not ask anything. A free man asks. Pharaoh asked me twice at the ford whether he should fall back if the line broke. Pharaoh had been bound 12 hours, and he still argued about details, because argument about details is what a soldier is, and the binding takes the will and leaves the trade. But you can bind a man out of asking the one question that matters, which is whether he is going to survive the next hour. And Dalm did not ask it, and I did not think of it for him. They hit the ford first, because it was the only place to hit. 22 men, 10 of them across the water in the first push, torches going down into the shallows and hissing out. Pharaoh's 4 held the line for about 90 seconds, and then the stakes did their work, and 2 men went down in the water with their legs opened up, and the rest came on over them. Mech put 4 arrows into that crossing from the roof, and hit with 3, which I am told is very good shooting in the dark, and I would not know, because I spent the first half of that fight lying flat behind a hearth with my hands over my head. That is true, and I am going to leave it in. I was 26. I had never been in anything worse than a bar fight. And there is nothing in a kitchen that prepares you for the sound men make when they are cut and cannot get away. Wen and the children were in the bone pit trench behind the barn, under boards, with Mira Sedge sitting on top of the boards with a hatchet, and she was the only person in the village who never once flinched that night. 6 of them found the gap. Whether they knew about it or found it by luck, I never learned, because none of the 6 lived to be asked. Dalm held it for 11 minutes. I was not there. I heard it. There is a particular sound that a felling axe makes when it is used the way an axe is used on wood, and not the way a weapon is used on a man, which is slower and much heavier, and it went on and on. When we got there with lamps, the gap was blocked. That is the word Gorse used in his report to me the next morning, and it is the accurate one. It was blocked with what had come through it. Dolm was sitting with his back against the fallen beam and the axe across his knees. He had been opened twice under the ribs and once in the thigh, and he had held the gap for 11 minutes with those wounds, and then he had sat down. He was still alive when we got there with the lamps. He looked up at me, and out of everything he could have said, he asked me whether the gap was still held. I said yes. He said good. And then he said the only thing that was ever his own, which was that the second roof was not finished, and that the north corner needed 2 more beams or it would take water in the winter. Then he asked me if he could stop now. Those were the words he used, not help me, not stay with me, not send for anyone, whether he was allowed to stop. I have thought about that question for a very long time. He was not asking permission to die. He was asking permission to stop holding the gap, because I had told him to hold it, and nobody had told him he could stop. I said yes. He stopped. It took about a minute, and he did not make any noise while it happened, and Gorse stood behind me the whole time with a lamp and did not put it down. I sat there in the wreck of 2 burned houses with my hand on a dead man's shoulder, and I understood something that I had been carefully not understanding for 8 days. I did not have 9 servants and 6 soldiers. I had 15 people who would walk into a gap and stand there until their legs stopped working, and none of them would ever ask me whether it was worth it. That is not an army. An army has men in it who go home. That is something else, and I had built it out of hungry men and a hot pot, and it was mine, and I had just spent some of it. The rest of that night, I fought the way I am actually built to fight, which is slowly, from behind a fire, against people who are cold and have nothing to do. The raiders pulled back across the ford at about the 3rd hour. They had lost 6 at the gap and 5 at the water, and they could not get in, and they sat down in the dark on the north bank to wait for light. 22 had become 11. 11 cold, wet, frightened men in the dark, on an empty bank at 3 in the morning, with nothing to do but sit. And on my side of the water there was a hearth that does not go out, no matter how wet the wood is or how long the night runs. So I did not attack anybody. I put 4 pots on it. Bone stock out of the pit, thickened with cattail flour, the last of the horse marrow, roasted ramson, thyme, and a great deal of soot salt. Gorse on 1 pot, Pharaoh on another, Tatch and his sons on the other 2, and me standing in the middle of the 4 of them calling the whole thing out like a Friday service. Then I opened the barn doors so the draft came off the ford, and I put green wood at the back of the fire so the smoke would sit low on the water instead of going up. Aroma at Hamlet rank carries about a mile in still air, across 12 feet of running water at 3 in the morning onto 11 men who had eaten a strip of dried meat at noon and lost half their friends since it did not need to carry. The first one came across at the 4th hour. He came alone, without his weapon, waiting, with his hands out flat where we could see them. I met him at the water with a cup, portioning down to 3 swallows. He drank it standing knee-deep in the ford with his boots full of water, and he handed the cup back, and he was on my books before he got to the bank. The second and third came together 20 minutes later. Then 2 more, then 4 at once, which was the moment the thing broke properly, because men will do in a group what they are ashamed to do alone. By first light, I had 9 of the 11 kneeling in the mud on my side of the water, and their fires were still burning on the north bank, with nobody around them. Rook came last, and Rook did not come across the water to eat. I understood that from about 30 feet away, and I put the cup down and picked it back up anyway. He was a wide, gray, careful man of about 45, and I had built a completely wrong picture of him in my head. I had expected a shouter. He came down to the water alone at dawn and stood there and looked at his 9 men kneeling in my mud. He asked me what I had put in it. I said stock, flour, fat, roots, and salt. He said that was not an answer, and I said it was the only answer there was. Then he told me, and I have never forgotten the phrasing, that he had watched a man eat a hot meal from a stranger in a burned village and go down on his knees like a dog, and that he would rather be hungry until he died than be that. I offered him the cup anyway. I want that on the record. I held it out over the water, and I told him what it was, and I told him what would happen if he drank it. He said no. He was entitled to say no. That is the one thing in this entire business that a man is always entitled to do, and I have never once been able to make it not so. Then he threw a knife at me underhand from 6 feet, which is a much better way to kill a man than throwing it overhand, and it went into the meat of my shoulder above the collarbone. I sat down in the ford. The cup went into the water. Pharaoh put a spear through Rook's chest from the bank before I had finished falling, and Rook went face down in the shallows about 4 feet from me, and neither of us said anything else. That is how I got the scar that everybody later decided was a battle wound. It was a thrown knife from a man who had refused a cup of soup. The page said it while I was still down in the water. Bound servants, 31. Cook level 5. Skill improved. Aroma. Carries further over water and smoke. I got the numbers while I was on my back in the water with Pell's hand jammed into my shoulder, and I remember thinking that the page had no sense of occasion whatsoever. 16 new. A blacksmith, which I badly needed. A charcoal burner. A man who had been a ferryman on the Ost and knew every crossing between Grafen and the capital. 2 who had been farmhands. 1 who could read, and 6 dead in the gap and 5 in the water. And Dulm laid out on a board in the barn he had roofed, under the corner, that needed 2 more beams. The blacksmith's name was Ren Otter, and he had been taken off a road 4 years earlier and had not touched an anvil since. And when he understood that Rotbrook had iron in the middens and no forge, he asked me for 2 days and a hole in the ground. The ferryman was called Wick, and he drew the river Ost on the barn door in charcoal that morning, from Grafen down to the capital. Every crossing, every mill weir, every place a cart goes over in summer and cannot in spring. I stood and looked at a map of the Empire's soft belly, drawn by a man who had tried to kill me 8 hours earlier. That is the shape of the whole thing, and I saw it clearly for the first time standing in front of that barn door. Every man who comes to end me arrives carrying the one thing I am short of. The Empire kept sending me exactly what I needed and calling it an attack. We buried him at the top of the lane in the gap, which was Gorse's idea, and which I did not argue with. Mira Sedge said the words because she was the only one who remembered any. Wen would not come. She stood in the square by the hearth with the ladle in both hands and would not come up the lane, and afterward she went and served 9 kneeling strangers their breakfast without looking at any of them. That night, I climbed up on the barn roof and put the 2 beams in the north corner myself. Badly. Gorse had to redo one of them the following week, and he never mentioned it to me. At some point during the burial, the page opened with a new task, and it had a clock on it, and the clock did not care what day it was. It said, "Your ground has no boundary and cannot be raised. Bind 1 master of a building trade. 7 days. Reward, territory rank advanced to village. A master of a building trade. In a district where every mason, carpenter, and well digger belonged to a guild, and every guild in Grafen took its charter from the Baron, and the Baron had a letter on his desk about a cook who was stealing his soldiers. I did not have to go looking for one. That is the thing about this life that I never fully got used to, and the thing that should have made me suspicious a great deal earlier than it did." Mira Sedge added the dead to her board that morning. 11 raiders went under the line, because a dead man cannot be fed either, and she was strict about that. Dulm went on a 3rd mark of his own, off to the side, in a corner by himself. She would not explain what that column was for, and I did not ask her, and she kept it up for years. 4 days later, a mason walked into Rotbrook on his own 2 feet, with his tools on his back and his guild mark on his collar, and asked whether we needed a wall built. The mason's name was Halder. He was about 40, and he had the best hands I have ever seen on a human being. That is not praise. It is the reason the next 6 days went the way they went. He came up the lane with a leather roll of tools across his back and a guild mark stamped into a brass tab on his collar, and he stood at the edge of the square and waited to be noticed, which is what a tradesman does and what a soldier never does. He said he had heard Rotbrook was building. He said he had a season free. He said his rate was 4 coppers a day and his own food, and that he would want to look at the ground before he agreed to anything. Gorse wanted him searched. Pharaoh wanted him turned around at the ford. Mira Sedge looked at the guild tab for a long time and said the Grafen Masons did not have seasons free in autumn, because autumn is when everybody wants a wall before the rain. I let him stay, and I want to be clear that there was nothing clever in it. There was no plan, no trap, no test, and no suspicion worth the name. I let him stay because there was a task page in the corner of my eye with a clock running on it, because I badly wanted a wall, and because he was the only master builder who had ever walked into Rotbrook in living memory. He walked the ground for a day and a half before he touched a stone, and everything he said in that day and a half was correct. He said the ford was our gate whether we liked it or not, so the wall should not try to be a circle. He said a circle around Rotbrook would be 400 yards of stone, and we did not have 400 yards of stone or the years to lay it. He said the ridge overlooked us, and the ditch line on the west was soft, and that anybody who came at us properly would come at the west and not at the ford, because the west is where a man goes when he can read ground. He said the wreck at the top of the lane was the worst thing on the site, and he did not know that we had buried a man in it 4 days earlier, and I did not tell him. For 6 days he worked, and the wall came up, and it was beautiful. And here's the thing I could not stop noticing. He never ate. Not once. Not one bowl, not one crust, not one cup of anything. He carried his own bread in a cloth and he ate it sitting apart on a stone at midday, dry, with water from the well that he drew himself. On the second day, Wen took him a bowl, because Wen took everybody a bowl and had strong feelings about her order of service. He thanked her properly by name and did not touch it, and gave it back full. On the third day, Tatcha's eldest tried the direct route and put a plate of hot flatbread down beside his hand while he was working. Halder said thank you and worked around it until it went cold. And I understood exactly what I was looking at, because Sabin Krell had written 6 rules by candlelight in a wayhouse and had them copied out to every officer in the assessment. And the first rule is, do not eat. The second rule, which I learned later, is that if you must eat, eat where the cook cannot see the bottom of your bowl. So I had a master builder on my ground, a page with a clock on it, and a man who had been briefed. I did not know he had been briefed. I only knew he did not eat, and there are honest reasons a man does not eat at a stranger's fire. I did not provoke him. I want that on the record too, because provoking Krell had worked, and it had cost me the only man in Greyfen who could have opened the barony for me. And I had learned exactly one lesson from it, which is that insulting people is not a strategy. So I did the other thing instead. I watched what that man did with his hands when nobody was talking to him. He measured, constantly, all day, every day. He paced the ford at the low water line, and the distance from the barn to the ridge road, and the width of the lane at 3 points, and he wrote none of it down, which is the part that eventually told me everything. A mason writes measurements down. A mason has a stick with notches on it and a scrap of slate. A man who memorizes distances and refuses to write anything is not carrying figures home for himself. Pell followed him on the 4th evening when he walked out to the oak stand, and came back to tell me that Halder had stood at the top of the ridge for a quarter of an hour, doing nothing at all. Facing south, in the open, standing exactly where a man can be seen from the Greyfen Road by anybody who has been told to watch that ridge at dusk. Standing in the open on a ridge at dusk is not doing nothing. It is a signal that costs nothing and cannot be intercepted, and it means the same thing every time, which is, I am still here, and the work continues. I still did nothing. There was nothing to do. He was not marked. There was no line over his head, no light, no page. To the kitchen, Halder was a stranger who had come to lay stone, and the fire would not have lit for him if I had begged it. On the 6th day, he opened his hand on a course of stone. It was a stupid accident, and it was nobody's fault at all, least of all his. He was setting a heavy block with a bar. The bar skipped on wet stone, and the edge of the block came down and took the skin off the back of his left hand from the knuckles to the wrist and cracked 2 of the bones underneath. He did not shout. He sat down on the course he had just laid, held the hand up against his chest, and said, in an ordinary voice, that he was going to need it bound. We bound it. Mira Sedge did it, with cloth boiled in the pot, because she was the only one who knew how. By that night, his fingers were fat, and the red had started running up past the wrist in 2 lines, and Mira told me flatly that she had seen those 2 lines 4 times in her life, and that the man died 3 of them. He would not eat. He was shaking with fever, and he would not take anything from anybody, and he sat against the new wall with his hand in his lap, and his own dry bread in his good fist, and he chewed on it, and could not swallow it. That is when I did the thing I did. And I want to be honest that I did it out of ordinary decency and not out of strategy, because it is the only time in this story where that is true. I went to the hearth to make him a broth, not for the kitchen, not to bind anybody. Because a man with a poisoned hand needs hot liquid and salt and something with fat in it, and I knew perfectly well that the fire would not light, and I was going to have Gorse make it, and I was going to stand behind him and tell him how. I picked up the flint out of habit. I struck it once, the way you do without thinking, over a bed of tinder I had laid for somebody else to use. The fire caught on the first strike and went up hard and clean. I stood there with a flint in my hand and my ears ringing. For 6 days that man had cut stone for my village, refused my food out of what I had assumed was pride, warned me about the West Ditch line, and told Wen thank you by name. And the fire had just told me that he wanted me dead. That is what the kitchen actually is, and it took me 23 days to see it. It is not a weapon. It is a question you can ask any man in the world without opening your mouth, and it always answers honestly, and you cannot unask it. I stood there for a while. Then I made the broth myself, on my own fire, with my own hands, and I made it properly, because whatever else was true, he had 2 red lines running up his arm, bone stock reduced by half, fat off the top of yesterday's pot, ramson, thyme, a great deal of salt, and I put it through a cloth twice until there was nothing in it that a man could count, because I had learned that lesson from a bean. Then I sat down next to a man who wanted me dead, and I had to decide what I was, because I had full information for the first time in my life. He was marked. The fire would light. If I gave it to him and he drank it, he was mine, and it would not be a fight or a siege or a raid. It would be a sick man taking soup from the person nursing him. And if I put the cup down and walked away, he would be dead by morning, and I would still have a wall, and nobody would ever ask me about it. Neither of those is a clean thing to do. I have never found the clean version. I have looked. I fed him. I held the cup, and he drank it, because a man in fever does not count, and does not measure, and does not remember the rules he was given. And he finished it, and put his head back against his own stonework. Bound. 32. The fever broke in the night, which had nothing to do with the kitchen and everything to do with hot salt water, and a woman who knew how to open a hand and drain it. Mira Sedge did that part at 3 in the morning by lamplight, and Halder did not move while she did. In the morning he was sitting up, and he was mine, and he answered every question I put to him in the flat, obliging voice, and it was the worst hour of information I have ever received. He had been sent, not by the Baron directly, by the Masons of Grafen, at the written request of the assessment office, over the signature of Sabin Krell, 12 days after Krell rode out of my square with an empty case. His instructions were 4 lines. Take the work. Learn the ground. Do not eat. Report the west approach, the water, the count of armed men, and the exact position of the hearth. The hearth. Not the wall, not the ford. They wanted to know where the hearth was, which meant that somebody in Grafen had already understood that the hearth was the thing, and that killing me was secondary to putting that fire out. And then he told me the last line of his instructions, and he told it in the same flat voice, and I have never been able to hear it any other way. The last line said that when the work was done, he was to be paid, and the village was to be taken with the people inside it, and the walls he had built were to be used to keep them in. He had been building me a pen. 6 days of the best stonework in the district, and every course of it had been laid by a man who knew what it was for. I asked him whether he had known that when Wen brought him the bowl. He said yes. I asked him why he had thanked her by name. He said because she had told him her name, and that seemed a strange thing to be rude about. That is the man. That is what people are. He would have walked out of my gate and let it all happen, and he would have been polite to the child the whole way through, and he would not have thought of himself as a monster, and he would have been right the way Krell was right. Bound servant Halder, master of the Grafen Masons, 19 years, skill, stone, ditching, siege works, foundation, assigned to territory as building, territory task complete, 1 master of a building trade bound, with a day and a half to spare on the clock. But the rank did not come, because the wall was 40 yards of a job that needed 300, and the page said what it had said before. Your ground has no boundary. And Halder, who had been mine for about 4 hours, put his good hand on the map on the barn door, and told me I was thinking like a man who had seen a castle in a picture. He said a boundary does not have to be stone. He said stone is what you build when you have 20 years. He said what you build when you have 2 days and 30 men is a ditch and a bank. Dig a trench 6 feet deep and 8 wide, throw every spadeful up on the inside, hammer the face, and top it with the stakes we already had. It is not pretty, and it will not stop an army, and it does not have to. It has to be a line that says inside and outside. 32 bound men and 14 villagers dug 240 yards of ditch and bank in 2 days, from the ford around the west approach to the top of the lane. Halder walked the line the whole time with one arm strapped across his chest, telling people where the face was wrong, and it was wrong a great deal more often than anybody wanted to hear. On the evening of the second day, Pell hammered in the last stake, and the page changed while I was watching him do it. Territory rank advanced, hamlet to village. Village to town is a long road. Hamlet to village is not, and Rotbrook crossed it at dusk on a Thursday with a mud bank and a line of sharpened sticks. The reward came up in the bank itself, cut into the west side where Halder had said the ground was cold. A stone room the size of a large barn, floored, drained, and about 10 degrees colder than the air outside it. The page called it the larder, and under that it put one more line, skill unlocked, hidden spice. A dish may be built so that a man tastes what he expects and not what is in it. Mira Sedge walked into that cold room, put her hand on the wall, and started listing out loud what could be kept in it and for how long, and she went on for about 4 minutes without stopping, and by the end of it she was crying and still listing. 48 people, a ditch, a bank, a forge, a cold store, a hearth that does not go out, and a master mason with 2 cracked bones in his hand, and a report that never arrived in Grayfin, which is a thing that gets noticed a great deal faster than a report that arrives with bad news in it. 11 days later, Wick came in off the river road at a dead run to tell me that a company of professional soldiers had come up the Ost and camped at the mill weir, 4 miles north, and that they were not the Baron's men, and they were not flying anything at all. The company at the mill weir was not there to burn Rotbrook. That is what took me 2 days to understand, and understanding it late nearly finished me in a ditch on the river road. 42 men, matched kit, which nobody in a levy has, 2 farriers, a paymaster's cart, picket set at the correct distance in a place where nobody had ever attacked anybody, which is how you tell professionals from men with weapons. Wick knew what they were before Gorse did, because a ferryman sees every company that goes up and down a river for 20 years. He said they were the Ash Company, and that they did contracts, not wars, and that a contract has one name written on it. Mine, not the village, not the wall. The Baron of Grayfin had looked at the problem of Rotbrook, and had done the sensible thing, which is that you do not besiege a fire. You kill the man who keeps lighting it. He had not hired them in his own name either. That came out later. He had gone through a broker at Ostvale so that no page anywhere in the barony would ever carry the words Merrick and Rotbrook in the same line. So on the 3rd morning, I went up the river road with Gorse and Pell to look at them, because I had convinced myself that a company that had not moved in 2 days was a company that wanted to talk. They had not moved in 2 days because they were waiting for me to come out on my own, and on the 3rd morning I did exactly that, with 2 men and no armor and a great deal of confidence. It happened at the cut above Ello Ford, where the road runs between a bank and the water for about 90 yards, and there is nowhere at all to be. 12 archers on the bank, spread, already drawn, before any of us saw a single one of them. Gorse took the first arrow through the top of the shoulder and went down on the road. Pell got a fist in his collar and dragged him over the lip into the drainage ditch on the water side, and I went in on top of both of them with my face in 6 inches of cold mud. 3 more arrows came into the bank above us in the time it took me to get my head down. Then they stopped because they were professionals, and professionals do not shoot at mud. The ditch was about 4 feet deep, 2 feet of it water, and it ran for maybe 30 yards before it opened out onto the shingle where anybody who wanted to could kill us at leisure. Gorse said, in the flat, obliging voice, that he could stand up and draw their shooting so that I could get out along the water. He meant it. He had an arrow through his shoulder, and he was offering to walk out onto a road for me, and he would have done it if I had said the word. I said no. Then I made myself say it a second time in a proper order, because I had learned in the gap at the top of the lane that a bound man does exactly what you say and nothing you assume, and I said stay in the ditch until I tell you otherwise. Then I sat in the mud and did the arithmetic, and there was not very much of it. We had a bow with a broken string, a hatchet, my ribs, an arrow through Gorse, and no food. And a pot. I had a small covered pot in a satchel with the day's stock in it, because I had been going to a meeting and I have never in my life gone anywhere without something to put on a fire. 12 archers were on that bank. 30 more men were within a horn call. I had a pot with 2 pints in it, wet ground, and green willow, and I was going to have to make it enough. Fire first. That is harder than anything else in this story, and nobody who has not done it knows. Wet willow, mud, and no dry tinder except the inside of my own coat lining, which came out in a handful and went straight down. The fire caught first strike because there were 12 marked men on a bank 40 yards away, and the kitchen has never once cared about the weather. Then I built it wrong on purpose. Green wood on top, a lid of wet moss, mud around the base, so that the whole thing sat there smothering and shoving out a low white smoke that ran along the ditch and out over the water instead of going up. Aroma at village rank goes about 2 miles in still air. It goes considerably further along a river cut because the cut holds it like a pipe. Then I cooked. In a ditch. In mud. With an arrow in the bank over my head. With a wounded man breathing badly at my elbow. And I did the best 2 pints of my life to that point. The stock was already made. What I did was reduce it. Hard, until it went dark and thick and the fat came up. And then I put in the only 3 things I had in my satchel, which were salt, thyme, and a fistful of parched barley. Reduction is the whole trick. Reduce a stock by 2/3, and the smell of it stops being food and becomes an argument. It goes into a man's head and starts talking to him about his mother. The first one came at about a quarter of an hour. He came alone, down the bank, with his bow across his back and his hands loose, and he did not call out to the others first, which told me everything about what the last fortnight had been like for him. He came down into the ditch and he did not draw. He asked me what I was cooking. I told him. He asked whether it was true what the cook at Rotbrook did to people who ate his food. That was the first time anybody ever asked me that question straight out, and I made a decision in that ditch that changed the rest of this story, and I made it in about 2 seconds and mostly out of tiredness. I told him the truth. All of it. The rule, the finishing, the permanence, what it had done to Gorse and to Pharaoh, and what it had not done to Sabin Krell. He stood there in the water for a moment. Then he said the Ash Company had been on half rations for a fortnight because the broker's second payment had not come, and that he had eaten a strip of dried fish that morning, and that his contract was for 6 months and there were 4 left. Then he asked me for the cup, knowing exactly what it was, and drank all of it, and knelt down in a ditch with his own men 40 yards away. The page said something it had never said before. Bound by consent. Judgment retained. I did not have time to understand what that meant. I filled the pot again with water and the bones I had, and I put it back on, and I told him to go up the bank and tell them there was nothing down here but a dead horse. He went up the bank and lied to 12 professional soldiers for me with a completely straight face, and stood there and took part in the conversation about how the smoke was probably a burning cart, and came back down the ditch 20 minutes later with 2 more men. That is the moment the Ash Company ended, and none of them noticed for another 2 hours. 4 came at the half hour, 6 more before noon. Every one of them came down that bank because a man they trusted had told them there was hot food, and every one of them got the whole truth from me before they got the cup because the first one had gone down easier for having heard it. By the middle of the afternoon, I had 23 of 42 sitting in and around that ditch, and the ones above had stopped being an ambush and started being a problem for their lieutenant. Her name was Rin Corvale, and she came down the bank at 4 in the afternoon, alone, in armor, with her sword still on her hip and her hands where I could see them. And she looked at 23 of her own men sitting in a ditch, and she did not say one word about it. She was about 30, broken nose, healed straight, which means somebody said it properly, which means she had been somewhere with a surgeon. She looked at the fire, and the pot, and the arrow in Gorse's shoulder, and then she looked at me for a long time. She said she wanted the terms, not the food, not the trick, the terms. And that is when I understood I was dealing with somebody entirely different from every person I had bound in the previous month. I gave them to her the same way I had given them to the first man. She asked questions, good ones, whether the binding could be reversed by my death, whether I could order a bound man to harm himself, whether I had ever done it. I said I did not know about the first. I said yes to the second, and I told her about Gorse and the Hearthstone on the day I was testing my new toy, and about Dulm and the Gap, and I did not shape either story to make myself look better. She listened to all of it standing in the mud with her hand on her sword hilt. Then she made her case out loud, as if she were reporting to somebody, and I think she was, and I think it was herself. She said the contract was dead. 23 men of 42 had eaten, and there was no reassembling that. She said a company that fails a contract at half strength does not get another one, and that the broker at Ostvale would not pay the balance for a failure. She said the men who were left would scatter inside a week, and that scattered mercenaries in Greyfen in autumn become bandits by winter and hang by spring, and that she had personally cut down 2 of her own men for less. Then she said the part that I have quoted to people ever since. She said she had eaten the Empire's bread for 12 years and had never once been asked whether she wanted it, and that at least this cook had told her what was in the cup before she picked it up. She picked it up. She drank it. She did not kneel, and I have never been able to work out whether that was the consent or whether it was simply Rin. Bound by consent. Judgment retained. Bound servants, 74. Cook level 6. 42 professional soldiers, 2 farriers, 31 horses, a paymaster's cart with the first half of a contract still in the chest, and a signed broker's warrant with a name on it that was not the Baron's, but which led to him in 2 steps. And a lieutenant who, before we had walked 400 yards back down the river road, had already told me I was doing it wrong. She said the ditch had worked and would not work twice. She said Krell's rules were already in the Greyfen barracks and would be in the Crown's barracks by spring. She said I had won that afternoon by being underestimated, and that I would never be underestimated again as long as I lived, and that I had better start building for the version of me that everybody had already heard about. Then she stopped in the road and asked me the question that I have never fully answered, and she asked it in the same flat working voice she used for everything. She said I did not have an army. She said an army is a thing that argues, and that when I stood in front of something that needed one man to tell me I was wrong, every mouth on my side would be full. I said she was arguing with me right now. She said yes, and that she was one, and asked me what I thought that meant about all the others. The chest in the paymaster's cart had 1,100 silver in it, which was the first half of a contract to kill me. Rotbrook had not held 1100 silver in its entire history, and now it had it because somebody had tried to buy my death and paid up front. I put 900 of it straight back out again inside a week. Iron for Ren Otter's forge, 2 carts of salt off the Ost, seed rye, because a village that eats what it forages in autumn is a village that starves in March. Rin Corvale watched me spend it, and said that was the first thing I had done all day that a soldier would recognize as sense. Wen met her that evening at the hearth and looked her up and down and asked her whether she was going to be trouble. Rin said probably. Wen said good, and served her forth, ahead of the bound men and behind the sick. Gorse walked the whole 4 miles home with an arrow in his shoulder because nobody had told him to sit down, and I did not notice until Mira Sedge took one look at him in the square and started shouting at me and not at him, which was correct. We got the arrow out that night. Halder held him. Mira did the cutting. Rin Corval stood at the end of the table and told me, while it was happening, exactly how a professional company would have taken Rotbrook if the Baron had bothered to pay them properly. West approach. At night, 4 days of rain, ditch and bank pulled down with grapples, ford screened with archers, and every one of my kneeling men killed on the bank because a bound man does not break and run, and therefore does not survive. She said it as a report. She said it because I needed it. And she was the only person in that village who could have said it, because she was the only one who could still choose to. Orvin Merrick got the news at Grafen 6 days later, from a broker's clerk who had ridden all night and who did not want to be the man in the room. The Baron did not shout at him either. Nobody in this story ever shouts. That is the thing about power. He asked one question, which was whether the company had been destroyed or bought. The clerk said neither, and could not explain the third option, and the Baron sat with that for a while, and then called for his herald and his levy in the same breath. Because a lord can survive losing a war. What a lord cannot survive is a story in which 42 paid soldiers walked into a village and came out belonging to a beggar, and the story was already moving faster than the levy could. 11 days later, a herald came down the ridge road under a white staff, in the Baron's colors, and read out a declaration in front of my hearth in a very carefully trained voice. Orvin Merrick, Baron of Grafen, declared the settlement at Rotbrook to be in rebellion, its people outlaw, its holdings forfeit, and its cook to be taken alive. And every man on that road, and every man in the levy behind him, and Orvin Merrick himself in his hall 40 miles south, went on to my page in a single line of light while the herald was still reading. A declaration of outlawry is read out loud in a square, and the moment it is read, every man who acts under it is acting against you personally. I found that out standing next to my own hearth with my mouth open. The herald finished the last line, and the page in the corner of my eye did something I had never seen and never saw again in quite that way. It did not open one line, it opened a column, and the column kept going. Enemy, enemy, enemy. 411 marks, unrolling faster than I could read, from a herald with a white staff down to a levy farmhand in a village 40 miles south who had been handed a spear that morning and had not yet been told why. Orvin Merrick had just handed me the entire fighting strength of his barony as legal ingredients, and he had done it with his own seal on it, and he did not know that until much later. I laughed. Out loud, in front of the herald, which was rude, and which I regret, because the man was doing a job and did it well and had a very good voice. Then Rin Corvale took me by the elbow, walked me 20 feet, and destroyed the best afternoon I had had since the ditch. She said the levy had been briefed. She knew because she had been in the Grafen barracks in the spring on another contract, and because a company lieutenant reads standing orders on a wall the way other people read a market notice. Sabin Krell's 6 rules were nailed up in the muster hall at Grafen. She had walked past them twice without understanding what they were. Do not eat at Rotbrook. If you must eat, do not finish. Carry your own bread. Eat before you march. Report any man who eats. Leave something on every plate. 411 enemies, and every one of them had been taught the counter by a tax officer with a spoon, and every one of them was going to walk into my valley carrying a strip of dried meat in his belt like a charm against me. That is the shape of the whole middle of this story, and it starts here. Up to that morning, my problem had been finding enemies. From that morning, my problem was that enemies had learned, and I never once got that advantage back. Rin put it in one line, standing in the mud by the ditch and bank, looking south. She said I had spent a month being a miracle, and that from now on, I would have to be a cook. So we built. 1,100 silver came out of the paymaster's chest, and went out again in 12 days, and I want to list what it bought, because this is the part of the story that people skip, and it is the part that kept 91 people alive. Iron for Ren Otter, 400 weight. Off a river barge at Ello Ford, 2 carts of proper white salt, 60 bushels of seed rye, 1,100 feet of rope, nails, which nobody thinks about and which stop a war, and stone. Halder took a crew of 30 to the old quarry cut above the oak stand, which nobody in Rotbrook had opened in 40 years, because the guild fee for opening a face was more than the village earned in a year, and there is no guild fee if you are already outlawed. The wall went up in 19 days, not 400 yards. Halder had been right the first time, and he was right now, and he built to the ground instead of to a picture. 110 yards of stone across the west approach, where the ground is soft, 6 feet thick at the base, faced on both sides, with the ditch we had already dug in front of it. That is the only part of Rotbrook that is stone to this day. The rest is bank, stake, and thorn. 200 yards of it, raised, hammered, and planted along the top with cut blackthorn, which Halder called a hedge, and which will take the hand off anybody who touches it. And a gate. That was the day. Ren Otter made the strapping, and Halder set the posts, and it took 6 men to hang the leaves. And when it swung shut for the first time, it made a sound that everybody in that valley stopped working to listen to. Mira Sedge stood in front of it and did not say anything for a long moment, and then asked, quite seriously, whether she was allowed to touch it. Wen, who had been born in a village that had never had a gate, went and stood on the walkway over it and looked out at the ridge road for about an hour and would not tell anybody what she was thinking about. We had 31 horses, 74 bound, 17 of the original people, a forge, a cold larder, a stone wall, a hedge, a gate, and a hearth that does not go out. And 9 days of food for 91 mouths, with a levy of 400 coming north, and an autumn that had already turned. I did the ration board myself. On the barn door, under Wick's charcoal map of the Ost, and Mira Sedge stood behind me and corrected the numbers twice, because she had been through 2 bad winters, and I had been through none. 9 days at full, 19 at 2/3, 31 at half, and at half a working man stops being a working man in about 3 weeks, which means the wall stops, which means the wall is why you starve. Wen looked at that board for a long time, and then asked me why the bound men were on the same ration as everybody else, since they could not refuse anything anyway. I said because they were people. She said she knew that. She wanted to hear whether I did. Here is the thing about walls. A wall does not feed you. A wall makes you a container, and a container with a fixed amount in it, and an enemy outside is a clock. Which is why I was almost glad when the moneylender arrived, and I have never been glad about a moneylender before or since. His name was Yesen Vask. He came up from Ostvale with 4 guards and a clerk in a covered carriage on a road that everybody said was closed, and he was carrying a paper that made him the owner of my village. Grafen's assessment debt on Rotbrook had been sold, which is a thing lords do all the time, and which no villager anywhere has ever been told about. You do not wait for a burned village to pay you. You sell the arrears at a discount to somebody who is willing to wait. And Vask's house had bought Rotbrook's paper for 9 silver in the spring. 9 silver. That was what my village had been worth on a market in a city I had never seen. And Vask had come north to see what he had bought before the Baron burned it, because a man who owns a debt does not want the asset destroyed by somebody who owes him money. He was 50, soft, extremely clean, and he did not get out of the carriage for the first hour. He asked his questions through a window. How many hands? How many roofs? What was in the larder? What the forge produced in a day? And he did not eat. Of course he did not eat, but not for Krell's reasons, which I only worked out when I put tasting on him and got the strangest line the kitchen ever gave me. It said, he has never in his life eaten anything he did not pay for. Not that he had never eaten well, that he had never once in 50 years eaten a gift. 50 years old, and every mouthful of food that man had ever taken had been bought, priced, invoiced, or owed. And a thing handed to him for nothing was not food, it was a trap. And he had built an entire life on knowing the difference. You cannot bind a man like that with hospitality. Hospitality is the one thing on earth he has trained himself to refuse. So I sold him dinner. I had Gorse go out to the carriage and inform the clerk that the kitchen at Rotbrook was open to travelers, that the rate was 4 silver a cover, and that payment was required in advance, and that we did not extend credit to anybody, including him, and least of all against paper that had been bought at 9 silver. 4 silver. A cover is a robbery. 4 silver a cover is what you pay in the capital in a house with a name. In a burned village behind a mud bank, it is an insult with a number attached. He paid it. He paid it in about 90 seconds, because I had priced him instead of feeding him, and a man who has never taken a gift in 50 years cannot walk away from something that has been correctly invoiced. Then I cooked, and I cooked to the price. That is the whole trade in one sentence, and it is the only lesson I would give anybody. If a man has paid 4 silver, 4 silver has to be on the table, or he will never trust a number you give him again. River pike from Wixweir, boned, poached in stock and butter I had bought at Ello Ford specifically for this. Roasted marrow bones from the pit. Rye bread from the first of the new flour. Roots turned and glazed in the pan fat. Nothing large, everything finished. And no countable things anywhere on that table. Nothing in 4s or 6s. Nothing that a man can leave one of and call it restraint. Vask ate for an hour and a quarter, alone in a burned village, in a covered carriage he had refused to leave, off a board across his own knees. He cleaned the plate. Of course he cleaned the plate. He had paid 4 silver for it, and a man who has never eaten a gift in his life has also never once left food that he purchased. Bound. 75. He came out of the carriage on his own legs, sat down on the step of it, and started talking to me about money in the flat, obliging voice, and he did not stop for 2 hours, and it was the single most valuable conversation of my life. Because Jessen Vask did not only own Rotbrook's debt, Jessen Vask's house held 4 separate notes against the barony of Grafen, signed by Orvan Marek over 3 years at interest against the harvest. So Orvan Marek was not marching north with 400 men because a village of beggars had insulted him in front of a herald. He was marching north because he had already spent the money he was going to make from taking it, and the man who had lent it to him was now sitting on the step of a carriage inside my gate, working for me. I asked Vask what happened if the Baron lost. He explained it the way you explain weather to a child. A lord who loses a war he financed does not lose a battle. He loses his credit, and after that he loses everything else in a fixed order over about 14 months. Bound servant, Jessen Vask. Moneylender, 31 years, House of Vask at Ostvale. Skill, credit, notes, valuation, and correspondence. Assigned to territory as treasury. Territory rank stayed where it was, because the page wanted 100 bound and a market with outside trade before it would say the word town, and I had 75 and a hedge. But something else changed that night, and I felt it before the page said it. Vask's clerk wrote 19 letters at my hearth, and Vask signed all of them, and they went south on his own horses under his own seal, and none of them mentioned me at all. They were ordinary letters about ordinary credit, and the effect of them, over the next 19 days, was that 4 merchant houses in Ostvale quietly stopped extending anything at all to the barony of Grafen. Rin read the copies and said something I have never forgotten. She said she had spent 12 years learning to break an army, and had just watched a fat man in a carriage do it with correspondence. He also did the one thing nobody else in that valley could do, which was put a number on us. He walked the ground for 2 days with his clerk and came back and told me what Rotbrook was worth on a market in Ostvale. 4,200. In the spring it had been 9 silver. He said the difference was not the wall and not the horses. He said it was 91 people who all knew what they were doing on a Tuesday, and that you cannot buy that anywhere at any price. Mira Sedge heard him say it and went and wrote the number on the top of her board, over the line, and it stayed there until the board rotted. The levy came into the valley on the 22nd day, and they did it properly, and I will give Orvan Marek that much for the rest of my life. 411 men in 3 blocks, with carts, with a farrier train, with tents in rows, and they stopped a mile out on the north bank of the ford, and they did not come one step closer. Every man of them had a strip of dried meat and a hard biscuit in his belt, and standing orders read out twice a day. They were not going to storm my wall. They were not going to burn my gate. They were going to sit on the only road out of that valley through an autumn and into a winter, and let a container with 91 people in it do what containers do. Faro stood on the walkway over the gate and watched his old company come up the road and form line, and he named the sergeants for me one by one as they came into view, and his voice did not change once. Goris asked me whether I wanted the gate opened for a parley. I said not yet. Rin said not ever, unless it was on ground I had chosen, and then she went and moved every archer we had onto the west wall, because the west is where a man goes when he can read ground. And on the 3rd morning of the siege, Halder came and told me that the ditch we had cut on the west had also cut the spring line, and that the well in the square had dropped 4 feet in 9 days. The well dropped 4 feet in 9 days because we had dug our own defenses across the vein that fed it. And I want to start with that, because it is the honest shape of everything I built that year. Every single thing I did to make Rotbrook safer made it more fragile in some direction I had not looked at. The wall made us a container. The ditch cut the water. The gate made the road matter. Halder fixed it in 4 days, and the fix was not clever. It was old. He found the spring head above the ditch on the west slope, and instead of letting it run into our own excavation, he put it in a pipe. The pipe was elm. You bore out a trunk with an auger, you socket the lengths, you bed them in clay, and you bury the whole run 4 feet down where nothing can foul it and nobody can cut it without digging. 230 feet of bored elm, laid by 14 men in 4 days, and on the 5th morning, water came out of a spout into a stone trough in the square and did not stop for the rest of the siege. The old well came back up in a week, once the vein was no longer bleeding into the ditch. So we had 2 sources, one of them buried, and Rin Corvale said that was the first thing she had seen in that valley that a besieging officer would actually be frightened of. Then we settled in, and I did the arithmetic on the enemy for the first time instead of on myself, and the arithmetic changed my entire life. 411 men. In the field, in autumn, a man eats about 2 pounds a day of something, and a horse eats 20, and Orvin Merrick had 60 horses. 91 people behind a wall on half ration burn about 130 pounds a day. 411 men and 60 horses in tents outside, it burned about 2,000. I had been thinking of myself as the thing in the jar. I was not. I was the thing they had to keep paying for. A siege is not 2 sides waiting. A siege is 2 supply lines, and mine was 400 yards long and ran from a larder to a hearth, and his was 40 miles long and ran through a barony whose credit Yes and Vask had quietly folded up a fortnight earlier. Vask explained it at my hearth with a stick and some ash on a board. An army in the field does not carry its food. It buys it on account from contractors along the road against the Lord's name. And 4 merchant houses in Osvale had stopped extending anything at all to the name of Merrick, which meant the contractors wanted coin, which meant the carts came late, which meant that on the 11th day of the siege, the levy went to 3/4 ration. They went to 3/4 ration a mile from a hearth that does not go out. I did not attack. I did not sally. I did not shoot. I did not send a single insult up the road. Rin would not have let me, and she was right. What I did was move the kitchen out, not far, 240 yards from my own gate, in the flat by the ford, on open ground where a man from either side could stand and see everything and nobody could be accused of a trick. Halder built the thing in a day and a half. A stone base, a chimney, an iron plate off Ren Otter's forge, a roof on 4 posts, and a long counter of planed elm with a board at one end for the pots. The page named it while the last post was going in. Skill unlocked, field kitchen. You may cook for 100 at one service. 100 at once. Up to that point, everything I had done had been done a cup at a time, 1 man at a time, in ditches and doorways. From that morning, I could put out a service. And then Rin gave me the rule that won the siege, and she gave it standing at the counter with her arms folded, and it is 4 words long. Never offer. Make them ask. She said an offer is an order to a soldier. An offer from an enemy is an insult, and an insult from an enemy is the one thing a sergeant knows exactly what to do with, and the whole camp closes around it like a fist. But a smell is not an offer. A man standing at a counter eating his own dinner is not an offer. And a soldier who has to walk 240 yards across open ground on his own legs and say the words out loud has already left. So twice a day, every day, for 22 days, I cooked at that counter in full view of 411 men, and I did not once call out to any of them. Morning service at 7, evening service at 4. Barley, bone stock, rye bread on the plate, roots, fat, salt, and on the 11th day, the first of the smoked river fish out of the new larder. I ate at the counter. Gorse ate at the counter. Wen carried the ladle and served in her order, and she stood there in full view of an army, and she was 9 years old and nobody in that camp could look at her for very long. The wind in that valley comes down the ridge and out along the water in the evening. Halder told me that on the first day. So evening service was at 4 when the wind moved, and the smoke went along the north bank at chest height across 411 men in wet tents. Orvin Merrick's answer was discipline, and I understood it, and it was the correct order, and it destroyed him. He had the standing orders read 3 times a day instead of twice. He put pickets between his own men and the ford, facing inward. He had a man flogged on the 4th day for walking down to the water without leave. On the 9th day, 2 men crossed at dusk and did not come back, and on the 10th he hanged a sergeant for not stopping them. That hanging cost him about 80 men over the following fortnight, and I know that because 40 of them told me so afterward in the same words, which is not a thing men usually agree on. I want to put down what the first crossing was actually like, because everything I have said so far makes it sound like a machine, and it was not. His name was Rannoch, and he was about 17, and he came across the ford at dusk on the 9th day with another man, and neither of them had a weapon, and both of them were crying and pretending not to be. He stood at the end of my counter, and he could not say the words for a long time. He had been told for a month that the cook at Rotbrook took men's souls. He believed it. He had come anyway. I told him the truth first, the way I had told the man in the ditch. All of it. Then I put a bowl on the counter and stepped back from it and put my hands behind me, because Rin's rule works right to the last inch, and the last inch is not touching the bowl. He ate it standing up. He cried the whole way through it, and he ate every bit of it. And afterward he asked me whether he could sit down, and I said he could do whatever he wanted. And he sat on the step of my field kitchen and slept for 4 hours. That is what winning looks like in this business. It is not a face slap. It is a 17-year-old asking permission to sit down. Then it was 2 a night, then 5. Then, on the 15th day, 14 at once, walking across the ford in a body in daylight with their hands empty, past their own pickets, and the pickets did not stop them because the pickets had been discussing it among themselves for a week. By the 20th day, I was cooking 2 services of 80, and field kitchen was running at capacity, and Gorse had stopped counting new men by name and started counting them by tenths. Bound servants, 243, cook level 8. Territory rank did not move. I checked it every night like a man checking a lock. 243 bound, a stone wall, a gate, 2 water sources, and the page still said the same 2 words it had said for a month. No market. Which is the kitchen all over. It does not care how many soldiers you own. It counts whether anybody outside your ditch chooses to trade with you. And in that autumn, the answer was nobody, because we were outlawed and the road was closed. And here is the other column, and I have never told this part to anybody who did not ask twice. 61 men ate at my counter in those 3 weeks and left something on the plate. They did it under orders. Krell's 5th rule and Krell's 6th rule, drilled into them at Greyfen. Some of them left a crust. 1 left a fishtail. 2 of them, at the same service, put a spoon of barley back into the pot in front of me and watched my face while they did it. Every one of those 61 is on Mira Sedge's board under the line. And every one of them walked back across that ford and went on being a soldier, and I have never been able to feed one of them since, and I never will. 61 men who came to my counter and were made permanently safe from me by a rule a tax officer wrote in a weighhouse, and 7 who never came at all. That is the part I would take back if I could take back one thing. 7 men died in that camp in the last week of the siege, from cold and hunger and a wet autumn, within sight of a fire that does not go out, because they had been told that eating was surrender and they believed it, and they were brave. I could not do anything about it. That is the whole truth. I could not carry food across the ford, because food carried by me and given to a man who does not choose it does nothing at all. The choosing is the thing. It has always been the thing. Wen asked me on the 19th day why I did not just take pots over there. I explained it 4 times and she understood it perfectly well on the first, and she kept asking because a 9-year-old will keep asking a question until the answer stops being unbearable, and it never did. Sabin Krell was at Greyfen the whole time. He never came north once, and I did not understand why until Vask explained it to me. And the explanation was that Krell had stopped being a tax officer somewhere around the 9th day. The barony had sent him the desertion returns, because desertion is a money matter. He read them, and he wrote a paper that went south instead of north. And by the end of that winter, he was not in the assessment office anymore. His paper did not say that Rotbrook was dangerous. It said that 411 men had been placed in front of a kitchen with correct standing orders, and that 3/4 of them had eaten anyway, and that the standing orders were therefore not sufficient. That is what separates a man who wants to beat you from a man who only wants to be right. Orvin Merrick broke camp on the 22nd day. He did it properly. That is the last thing I will say in his favor, and I mean it. He did not run. He formed what he had left, which was 94 levymen and his household. He burned his own supply carts so I could not have them, and he came down to the ford in person with 14 knights behind him. He sat his horse at the water and looked at my field kitchen and my counter and my gate and the wall behind it and the smoke going up out of a chimney in a village he had burned to the ground in the spring. I put a bowl on the counter and stepped back with my hands behind me, because I do not break my own rules, not even for a baron. He said he would not eat in a slave market. He said it clearly and loudly enough for both sides to hear, and then he said the thing that I have been arguing with in my head ever since, which is that he could not tell the difference between what I did and what a lord does, except that a lord admits it. Then he turned his horse and rode south with 94 men, and left the valley to me, and left 317 of his own people standing on my ground behind him, which left me with 317 new people in a village with 14 roofs, 4 days before the first frost, and a larder built for 90. That is what the end of a siege actually looks like from the inside. Nobody cheers. You stand on your own wall and you look down at 300 men sitting in wet grass waiting for you to tell them where to sleep. And you understand that you have won a problem. Rin had the answer inside an hour, because she had wintered companies before. Turf and timber longhouses, dug 2 feet down, 10 men to a fire, built by the men who were going to sleep in them, and Halder setting out the lines. And out of the household column, one knight did not go with him. He turned his horse out of the line at the water, walked it forward 20 paces, and sat there in full harness with his helm off, looking at me, while his lord's column went up the ridge road without him. He was about 45, gray, with a scar through one eyebrow and a surcoat that had been washed so many times the device on it was more thread than color. He said his name was Dane Aylward, knight captain of the Grafen household, and that he had taken an oath at 19 that he would eat from no hand but his own, and that he had kept it in 3 wars and 2 famines. And then he said he had been sent, by the Baron, to stay behind and end me, not by the sword. He said he was going to sit at my counter every day, in public, and take nothing, until my own people stopped believing that anybody had to. Sir Dane Aylward sat at the end of my counter every morning at 7 and every evening at 4 for 19 days, and he ate his own bread out of his own bag, and he was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to me. He did not sabotage anything. He did not lie about us. When a man asked him a question, he answered it straight, including the questions where the straight answer helped me. He simply sat there in full view at the busiest counter in the district and did not eat. Every day, in front of everybody, salt bread and water, out of his own bag, from his own hand. Tasting told me why the first morning, and it was the only time that skill ever gave me something I could not use. It said, salt bread and water from his own hand, every day for 26 years, by choice. There was nothing to reach for. No dish from a dead mother, no childhood, no hunger. A man who has deliberately eaten the same plain thing since he was 19 has removed the door I go through. Gorse wanted him put out of the valley. Pharaoh wanted him put in the river. Rin Corval, who had actually served with him for a season 12 years earlier, said neither, and said it in a tone that ended the conversation. She said, Dane Aylward was the reason the Grafen household had not looted 3 villages during the bad spring, and that if I put a hand on him, the story that came out of this valley would stop being about a cook who fed people. And she told me what he was actually doing, because I had not seen it, and it was not about my kitchen at all. He was not there to stop 300 bound men from eating. They had already eaten. He was there so that everybody who came up that road from that day forward would see, first thing, a man sitting at the counter, not eating and not dying, and not being punished for it. Because the story that had come out of the siege was that nobody could resist me. Sitting there, quietly, 10 hours a day, he was killing that story in public, and it worked, and I watched it work. Elo Ford stopped selling to us in the 2nd week. Then the mill at Catter. Then 2 carters who had been perfectly happy to take Vask's coin in the autumn suddenly had other work. That is what a boycott looks like from the inside. Nobody announces it. There is simply nobody on the road, and the page in the corner of my eye kept saying the same 2 words, which were no market. I had 380 people. A wall, a forge, a treasury, an army, and I could not buy a cart of salt within 4 miles, because one honorable man was sitting on a bench making it respectable to say no to me. So I tried to solve it, and the way I first tried is the part of this story I am least proud of. I went to the larder at night and I stood there with hidden spice open in the corner of my eye, and I worked out exactly how to do it. The skill lets you build a dish so that a man tastes what he expects instead of what is in it. Salt bread and water. That is a very simple thing to imitate and a very easy thing to hide inside. I got as far as the flour. I had the bowl out, and then I put it back on the shelf, and I went and sat in the cold on the step of the larder until my hands stopped shaking. I told Rin in the morning. She said I should have done it. She said it flatly, in the working voice, and she made the whole case, and the case was good. She said the man was there as a weapon aimed at 400 people who had nowhere else to go. That winter was 6 weeks out, that I was choosing my own conscience over their stores, and that a lord who does that is not moral, he is expensive. I said, if I ever fed a man something he did not know he was eating, then everything Orvin Merrick said at the fort about a slave market becomes true. And after that, I am only arguing about the decoration. She said that was a fine sentence and asked me what I was going to write on the ration board when the salt ran out. We did not speak for 2 days. That is the only time it ever happened. And I want it recorded that she was not wrong. She was simply not right. And there is a difference. And it took me a year to find the words for it. Then, on the 21st day, My kitchen poisoned 41 people, and Sir Dane Aylward did not have to do anything at all. It was the acorn flour. It was my fault in the specific boring way that things are actually somebody's fault. Acorn meal has to be leached in 3 changes of water, dried hard, and stored dry. We had made 14 barrels of it in the wet fortnight of the siege. 2 of those barrels went into the new turf longhouses instead of the larder, because the larder was full and because I did not walk down and look at where they had been put. Turf houses are warm and damp. Warm and damp is where mold lives. 2 barrels came back into service on a Tuesday, went into the morning porridge for the West Quarter, and by noon, there were 41 people on the ground. Bort had it worst. He was 13 by then. He had been carrying barrels because carrying barrels was the one job you can do with an arm that has healed crooked, and he had eaten 2 helpings because he had carried them. He was ill for 9 days. There was a night in the middle of it where Mira Sedge did not leave him and would not let me in the room. And I stood outside a turf house in the frost and listened to a boy be sick and could not do one useful thing about it. Nobody died. That is luck and not management, and I have never once described it any other way. And the whole time, at 7 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, Sir Dane Aylward sat at my counter and ate his own bread and said absolutely nothing about any of it. He did not need to. 400 people had just watched the man who feeds everybody put 41 of them on their backs, and there was a knight sitting at the end of the counter who had been quietly declining to eat that food for 3 weeks. So I did the only thing I know how to do about anything, which is process, not a speech, not a hunt for somebody to blame. Process written down, starting the next morning. I shut the kitchen for a day and a half, which nobody had ever seen, and which frightened people more than the sickness had. Then I put in the rules that Rotbrook still runs on, and every one of them came out of those 2 barrels. Every batch of anything gets a number and a date cut into the barrel head. Nothing goes into service before it has stood in the larder for a full day. Nothing is stored in a dwelling, ever, for any reason, including because the larder is full. A sample of every batch is kept back in a stoppered jar for 20 days. If the batch does harm, the jar is opened and the fault is found, and the fault is written in a book. And the first taste of every batch, every day, is mine. Not Wen's, not a bound man's. Mine, at the counter, in public, before service, out of the same pot. And if it is bad, I go down, and not a child. Mira Sedge took the stores, all of them. She had the only key from that week onward, and she had authority to refuse me personally, and she used it 14 times in the first year, and was right on 12 of them. Halder put a second larder into the West Bank in 16 days, because the first one being full was the actual cause of 41 people going down, and full is a thing you can fix with a shovel. I wrote all of it out on the barn door, next to Wick's map of the Ost, in charcoal, where anybody could read it or have it read to them. And on the 4th morning after that, Sir Dane Aylward came up to the counter at 7 and asked me a question, which was the first thing he had asked me in 3 weeks. He asked why the first taste was mine and not a servant's. I said because a rule that costs you nothing is not a rule. He said that was correct, and then he stood there for a while, and then he asked me what I was going to do about him. I told him the truth, which was nothing. I said he could sit at my counter until he was 90, and I would not stop him, and that he was right about what he was doing and it was working, and that I had thought about tricking him and had decided not to. I told him about the flour and the bowl and the step of the larder. I do not know why. I think I was tired. He listened to the whole thing without moving, and then he told me about the oath, and it was not what I had built in my head. He was 19 at the siege of Harrow Weir, on the losing side, in the 3rd month, and an officer of the besieging army sent bread across to the wall for the squires, out of ordinary decency, and Dane ate it. 9 weeks later, he was on a gate, when that same officer came through in the dark with 40 men, and Dane knew his face, and he hesitated. He was clear that it was not a betrayal. He said it was a quarter of a breath. 11 men died on that gate. He swore the oath the following spring, and he had kept it for 26 years. And he said the oath was never about poison. It was about owing. And then he said the thing that finished it, and he said it slowly, like a man reading his own handwriting from a distance. He said he had watched me for 22 days. He said he had come to end me, and had instead watched a man shut his own kitchen, hand his stores to an old woman with authority to refuse him, and put himself first in the line for anything that might be bad. He said a man building a slave market does not do any of that, because a slave market does not need a flour book and does not care which barrel the porridge came out of. Wen had said almost the same thing 4 days earlier, in about 9 words, standing at the counter with the ladle. She said the night was not the problem. She said the problem was that we had made bad flour and had to say so. She was 10 by then. She had also, without being asked, gone round every turf house in the West Quarter with Hesaloom and pulled out 4 barrels of anything at all that was being stored where people slept, and stacked them in the square where I would have to walk past them. Rin came and found me on the second night of Bort's fever, and stood next to me in the frost for a while, and then said she had been wrong about the bread and the spice. She said a man who would drug a knight would not have written the flower book. I said I did not follow. She said I would. Then he asked me for the terms, the way Rin had asked for them in the mud, and I gave them, and I did not soften one word of them, and I told him what he would lose. He said he understood. He said he wanted one condition, and it was not a condition about himself. He wanted the counter. He wanted to stand at it, every service, and put the terms to every man who came up it before I put a bowl down, and to turn away anybody he judged was not choosing, but only hungry. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He ate at the evening service, at 4, in front of the whole valley, at the end of the same counter he had been sitting at for 3 weeks. He did not kneel either. He put the bowl down, said it wanted more salt, and went and stood at the other end of the counter and started work. Bound by consent. Judgment retained. Bound servants, 244. Cook level 9. And here is what it actually bought me, which was not a knight. Sir Dane Aylward turned away 6 men in the first fortnight. 2 of them were from Catter. One was a carter's son from L.O. Ford, who had walked 12 miles because his family had lost their winter store, and Dane gave him a cart of rye out of my stores and sent him home unbound and told him why. That story went 4 miles in a day and 40 in a week. The knight who would not eat now stood at the cook's counter and sent hungry men away with food and no chains, and said out loud, every service, that nobody at Rotbrook was fed by accident. The mill at Catter reopened to us on the 9th day, without any letter or any negotiation. L.O. Ford came back on the 11th. A salt factor from Ostvale came up the river road with 2 barges on the 19th, on his own initiative, because Vask's letters had told him what the volumes were, and Dane's name had told him it was clean. We laid out the market on the flat by the ford, around the field kitchen, because that was where the road already stopped. 22 stalls in the first week. Grain, salt, iron, cloth, timber, fish, and wren otter, selling axe heads to men who had come to buy something else. And on a cold Thursday in the first week of winter, with a salt barge unloading and a knight arguing about the price of time with a woman from Catter, the page in the corner of my eye finally moved. Territory rank advanced. Village to town. Then it opened a second line under it, and that one was not a reward, and I read it 4 times standing in the middle of my own market with a ladle in my hand. It said, your holding is now large enough to be seen from the capital. Nothing else. No reward line, no building, no skill. Just that, sitting in the air over a market stall selling time. By the middle of the following summer, Rotbrook had 940 people in it, and the biggest building in the town was a kitchen, and there was no hall because nobody had ever got round to needing one. I want to do the before and the after properly, once, because it is the only way to make anybody believe the middle. The before is 17 people, 11 eggs, a jar of pickled turnip, 1 cracked pot, and a dead horse in the lane. The after, on the first market day of that summer, is 940 people and 382 bound. 2 larders, a forge with 4 hands in it, a board elm water main, a stone wall, a gate, and a blackthorn hedge. 42 stalls, and a granary with 1,100 bushels in it. And in the middle of it, on the flat by the ford where the field kitchen had stood during the siege, a stone building 110 feet long with 6 chimneys, 4 ovens, and a counter you could land a boat on. We never gave it a name. People called it the kitchen. Every other town in that province has a hall in the middle, where the man who owns the place sits. And we had a room where 400 people eat twice a day. And that is the whole difference. And everybody who came up that road felt it before they could say why. Nobody in Rotbrook cooks at home. That started as scarcity, because in the first winter, we could not afford 400 separate fires. And it stayed because after 1 winter of it, people would not go back. You do not cook. You do not wash up. You come to the middle of the town twice a day and sit down with whoever is there, and the order of the line is children, sick, workers, bound, and then everybody else. Wen made that order in the first week on a burned floor when she was 9, and by the summer she was 11 and had a slate and 2 helpers, and settled about 30 disputes a day, and I have never once overruled her. Then there is the other column, which grew too. 211 names under Mira Sedge's line by midsummer, 61 from the siege, and 150 more over the winter, because the 6 rules had been copied out of the Grafen Muster Hall into 14 others. Guild enforcers came in the spring to break the market, and 40 of them ate, and 9 of them left a crust and walked out immune, and those 9 went straight into service teaching other men how to do it. Nobody outside ever understood that part. Every time I won, I also permanently lost a slice of the world, and the slice never came back, and the men in it became teachers. The kitchen never gave me a way to fix that. I asked. I looked for a skill, a rank, a reward, anything. There is nothing. Whatever this thing is, it was built with one door that only closes. We got a great deal else though, and I will not pretend otherwise. Town rank came with a building, the way every rank did. It put a roadhouse up on the Ford Road, 2 floors, 14 rooms, stables, and a chimney that draws properly in a west wind. And it improved field kitchen from 100 at a service to 300, and it pushed aroma out to about 4 miles, which meant that from the middle of that summer, everybody coming up the Ost Road smelled Rotbrook before they saw it. That is a market. That is literally all a market is. Somewhere people have a reason to stop, which brings me to the merchants, and to the fact that every single one of them was spying on me, and that I encouraged it. 3 great houses sent factors in that spring. Ostvale, Katter, and a house out of the capital whose name I did not know yet. All 3 of them took stalls. All 3 of them sent letters south twice a month. Vask read the copies before they went, because Vask had trained 2 of the clerks himself. I did not stop one letter. I did not alter one word. Rin Corvale thought I had lost my mind, and I explained it to her once, at the counter, and she came round in about 4 minutes, which is fast for Rin. If nobody reports on you, the capital invents you. And what the capital invents about a man who takes soldiers off a roll is always worse, and always ends with an army. So, I let them write. 900 people, a stone wall, 380 bound, of whom every single one had come to attack the place. A market, a granary, a flower book, and a girl who decides the order of the line. Every word of that is frightening, and every word of it is true, and true and frightening is survivable. Rumor is not. Then Dama Ostri came up the road with 16 wagons to close us down, and she was the best enemy I had had since the tax office. She was a caravan mistress, not a merchant. There is a difference, and it took me a day to understand it. A merchant owns goods. A caravan mistress owns the road. She held the freight contracts for 4 houses on the whole northern Ost, which meant she decided where a wagon stopped for the night. And where wagons stop is where towns happen. 3 guilds had paid her a great deal of money to make sure the place wagons stopped was not Rotbrook. Her method was elegant, and it was working before she arrived. She had put a new relay yard in at Katter, 11 miles south, with water, a smith, and a walled paddock, and she had rerouted the whole northern schedule through it. 11 days of that, and my 42 stalls were down to 26. Nobody had attacked anything. She had simply moved the road. She came in person to look at what she had beaten on her way north, and the page marked her before her lead wagon was through the gate, which told me exactly what her instructions were. She was about 45, and I have never in my life met anybody with less stillness in them. She talked while walking. She ate standing at the tail of a wagon out of a cloth in her hand, on the move, while 3 people asked her questions. Tasting gave me one line, and it was the whole answer. It said, "A meal sitting down, not in 19 years, not a dish, not a childhood. A chair." So I did not cook anything at all for the first 2 hours. I walked the yard with her and answered questions about volumes and turned no argument at all. Then I asked her the one thing nobody had asked her in 19 years, which is what her schedule cost her. She started to give me the trade answer, and then she stopped in the middle of it, and I have thought since that stopping in the middle of a sentence was probably the rarest thing she did in a year. I said a relay yard at Katter sits 11 miles from the ford, and that 11 miles is exactly the distance a loaded wagon cannot make before dark in autumn, and that her drivers had therefore been building an extra half day into every northern run since spring, and had not told her because she frightened them. That was true. Wick had got it out of 2 drivers at the roadhouse in a single evening, because a ferryman knows how to ask a wagon man about hours. She sat down. That was all it took in the end. She sat down on a bench at the counter to argue with me about a half day, and I put a plate in front of her while she was talking, and I stepped back with my hands behind me. She ate the whole thing without once noticing that she was doing it, because she was busy winning an argument about wagon hours, and she was right about most of it. She finished the plate the way people do when their hands are busy. And then she stopped and looked down at an empty plate, and looked up at me, and did not say anything for what felt like a very long time. I told her afterward that I had not built the plate to trick her, and that is true. And I also knew exactly what I was doing when I put it down. And both of those things are true at once, and I am not going to pretend they are not. Bound. 383. Bound servant, Dama Ostri. Caravan mistress, 19 years. 4 houses of the Northern Ost. Skill, freight, relay, road contracts, and drivers. Assigned to territory as trade. The northern schedule came back through Rotbrook inside a fortnight, and it came back better than it had ever been, because she rebuilt it properly instead of spitefully. Ford crossing at midday. Feed and rest at Rotbrook. Catter as the morning stop, not the evening one. 61 wagons a month by the end of that summer. Then 90. The stalls went from 26 to 55, and the roadhouse ran full from the second week. And Vask started keeping a second book because the first one had run out of pages. And Dama Ostri ate sitting down at the counter once a day for the rest of her life and complained about the seating every single time. Territory rank did not move again after town, and the page was very clear about why, and the reason was the worst news I had had in a year. It said, "Domain requires a second holding that feeds itself. 1 town is a place, 2 towns is a country, and the kitchen had just told me, in 12 words, that if I wanted to stop being a curiosity, I was going to have to do the whole thing again somewhere else." Rin read my face and asked what it wanted now. I told her. She said good, because a man with 1 town defends a wall, and a man with 2 towns holds a road, and the road was the only thing in this province worth anything. Orvin Merrick lost Grafen that summer, and he did not lose it to me. Vask called in the 4 notes in the spring, on the correct dates, with the correct notice, in the correct form. There was nothing to appeal. A lord who has spent a harvest he did not get, on a war he did not win, against a village that is now a market town, runs out of ways to pay people. The crown took the barony into stewardship in the 6th month. That is the ordinary procedure. When a holding cannot service its obligations, an imperial steward is appointed, and the lord keeps his name and loses his hands. I felt nothing about it, which surprised me. And then I felt something about it a week later, which surprised me more. Orvin Merrick at the ford had said one true thing to me, and I had never answered it. And now there was nobody to answer. And then the crown steward came north to inspect his new stewardship with a column of imperial road guards and a secretary and 4 clerks, and at his right hand, in a gray coat with a leather case on a shiny strap, rode Sabin Krell. He was not a tax officer anymore. His new office had been created 6 weeks earlier, by warrant, and there was exactly 1 man in the empire holding it. Warden of the table. He got down off his horse in my market, in front of about 400 people, and he looked at the stalls and the granary and the roadhouse and the 110-foot kitchen with 6 chimneys, and he opened his case and began to write. He did not eat. He would never eat, and both of us knew that, and he had built his whole new life on being the one man in the world for whom that sentence was a fact and not a boast. He came up to the counter at the evening service, and he was perfectly courteous, and he asked me for the day's batch numbers, and I gave them to him, because they were on a board in charcoal and everybody had them. Then he told me what he had ridden 200 miles to say. He said the crown had no interest whatsoever in destroying Rotbrook. He said the crown had an interest in understanding it, and that an understood thing can be licensed, and a licensed thing can be taxed, and a taxed thing belongs to somebody. Wen served him. That was her order, and I did not interfere with her order for anybody. She put a bowl in front of the man who had burned her mother's house with her mother in it, and she stood there while he did not touch it, and then she took it away again. She came back to me afterward and asked whether that had been the man. I said yes. She asked whether he was going to be at the counter every day now, like the night had been. I said probably worse than that. She thought about it and then said something I did not understand for another 2 years. She said the knight had not eaten because he did not want to owe anybody, and this one was not eating because he did not want anybody to owe him, and that the second one was much stranger. He stayed 9 days. He measured the ovens. He copied the flower book by hand. He interviewed 30 bound men with his clerks writing, and he was gentle with all of them. And when he left, he took 400 pages south with him. Sir Dane Aylward watched him ride out and said, without any particular emphasis, that a man who wants to kill you sends soldiers, and a man who wants to own you sends clerks. 3 nights later, I came down to the kitchen before the morning service and found a dead man on the floor behind my own counter in the dark, with his own knife under his ribs and no marks on him anywhere else. He was nobody I knew, and nobody in the town knew him either. He had a market stall license in his coat, issued 4 days earlier, in a name that belonged to a man who had died at Catter in the spring. And on the counter above him, laid out square in the middle of the wood, where the first person through the door would have to see it, was a folded strip of black cloth with 9 knots tied along one edge. The black cloth with 9 knots in it is a notice. That is all it is. The hollow hand does not creep. They send you a page from their own rulebook, and then they keep to it. And the keeping to it is what makes them frightening. Rin Corvale read it off my counter and told me the whole thing before breakfast, because a mercenary lieutenant with 12 years on the roads knows every guild in the province the way a carter knows every hill. 9 knots is a contract accepted and opened. 30 days of observation, which they do not shorten. The dead man on my floor had taken the same job freelance without a license, and they had removed him as a matter of housekeeping before they started work. And the 4th line of their rule, which Rin made me repeat back to her twice, is that no member of the Hollow Hand eats or drinks anything at all inside the holding of a contracted target. Not from the target, from anybody at all. Not water, not bread, not a cup of ale in the roadhouse, not an apple off a tree in a field they are lying in. They carry their own, they eat outside the line, and they have kept that rule for 140 years, and every one of them can recite the 4 contracts that were lost when somebody did not, which meant that 400 people who came to my valley to kill me had eaten my food, and the 5th set were the first professionals in the world who had a written rule against the only thing I can do. I will not pretend I was calm about it. Rin ran the defense, and she ran it properly, and I stayed out of her way, and it cost us anyway. On the 9th day, a crossbow bolt came through the shutter slot of the north gatehouse at the evening service, from about 120 yards, and Pharaoh was standing where I had been standing 4 seconds earlier because he had moved me, and I had let him. It went through his shoulder and stood a hand deep in the doorpost behind him, and the shaft was still humming when I got to him. He was on his back for 6 weeks, and he never got the full reach of that arm back, and the first thing he said on the floor of my kitchen was that the angle meant they were shooting from the mill roof and somebody should go and look. They were not on the mill roof. They wanted us on the mill roof, and Rin had the sense to send 2 men and hold everybody else, and that is the only reason I did not lose 4 people that evening. The shooter was never found. That is not a failure of my watch. That is what 140 years of practice buys you. So I stopped trying to defend and started thinking about the actual problem, which was not the shooting. The shooting was housekeeping. The problem was 30 days of observation. Because a man who is watching me has to be near me. That is not a preference. It is the trade. And a man who is near me for 30 days under a rule that forbids him to eat or drink anything within my holding is a man on a very hard discipline. I went and asked Sir Dane about it, because he had spent 26 years on exactly that kind of discipline, and I wanted to know what it costs. He said, the eating is easy for a week and difficult for 3. He said the drinking is what breaks a man, and that anybody holding to that rule in my valley in high summer was walking 4 miles a day to a stream outside my line and 4 miles back with what he could carry. Then he said the thing that turned the whole month around. He said the rule is written as inside the holding. He said guild rules are written by lawyers, and lawyers write lines, and a line has an outside. So I left, not fled. I put Gorse on the gate, Rin on the wall, Dane on the counter, and I got on a horse with a cart and 4 bound men, and I went out on the road, and for 19 days I did not cook one service in Rotbrook. I cooked at Catter, I cooked at Ello Ford, I cooked at a shepherd's fold on the ridge above the oak stand, and at the mill weir, and twice at Crossroads with no name at all, and I did it once a day and I never announced where. And every one of those places was outside my holding, which meant the rule that protected the hollow hand from me stopped at my own ditch and left them standing in the open. They still had to be within sight of me. That is the contract. So 4 men who had spent a fortnight managing a very hard discipline inside my line now had to follow a moving kitchen around the district for 3 weeks in high summer on their own water. I did not offer them anything. Rin's rule holds everywhere. I cooked, I ate at the tail of my own cart in the open, and I let 4 miles of aroma do what it does across a shepherd's fold, with no cover on it for half a mile in any direction. The first one came in on the 6th day, at a crossroads west of Catter. He was about 22, and he had been on watch discipline for 15 days, and he had walked, by his own account, 190 miles of it fetching water. He did not come in to eat, he came in to talk, which is what they teach them to do when the discipline is failing, because talking to the target is a smaller offense than eating. I gave him the terms, and I put a bowl down and stepped back. He looked at it for about 4 minutes. That is a long time to watch a man look at a bowl. Then he ate it, and I want to be accurate about what happened next, because the guild is often described as a machine, and it is not. He cried afterward and asked whether the guild would be told, and I said not by me. And he said it did not matter because they would know within the day, and he was right, and they did. Second one, on the 11th day. third on the 14th, at the mill weir. And the third one was 40 years old and had been in the hollow hand for 19 years, and he came in walking perfectly steadily and ate without one word. Fourth on the 17th. And on the 18th, there were no more watchers in the district at all, because Sierra 9 had pulled the observation and started doing the job with her own 2 eyes. Bound servants, 387. Cook level 10. And they came with the whole guild in their heads. Structure, houses, signals, rates, where the hollow hand keeps its licenses, and how a contract is opened, held, transferred, and voided. That last one is what won it, and it did not come from a fight. A hollow hand contract is voided in exactly 3 cases. The target dies of something else, the client withdraws, or the client is found to have contracted in bad faith, which for a guild means one specific thing, and the specific thing is that the client is simultaneously acting to destroy the guild. So, I stopped thinking about assassins and gave the problem to a moneylender and a caravan mistress, which is a sentence I could not have written 18 months earlier. Look at the actual shape of what I had built by then, because it is worth saying plainly. I did not have a weapon. I had a fletcher, a mason, a ferryman, a blacksmith, a knight, a lieutenant, a banker, and a woman who owned 400 miles of road. Every one of them had walked into that valley intending to end me, and every one of them was now working on the same problem from a different side of it, and none of them needed me in the room. Rin made me say that out loud at the counter one evening, because she said I still talk like a man alone in a ditch with a pot, and that a man who talks like that eventually walks into a room he should have sent somebody else into. Yes, and Vask traced the payment. It took him 22 days and 19 letters. A contract of that size does not move as coin. It moves as a note, and a note leaves a shadow in 4 ledgers whether anybody wants it to or not. Dama Austri traced the courier because there are 6 men in that province licensed to carry sealed matter at speed, and she had personally hired all of them at some point in 19 years. The note had been drawn on a crown account, not the baron's, not a guild's. An imperial disbursement, warranted, signed, and issued out of the office of the warden of the table 12 days after Sabin Krell rode out of my market with 400 pages of my flower book in his saddlebags. And the second thing Vask found, which was in a different set of books entirely, and which took the 19 letters, was the draft of the Charter of Licensed Trades. Krell's own work. 11 pages. Section 4 abolishes the independent guilds of the Empire, including by name the Hollow Hand, and folds their licenses into the crown. He had hired the guild to kill me with one hand, and was writing the law that ended the guild with the other, and the law was dated 3 weeks before the contract. I sent Sura 9 a letter. 1 page. No threat, no offer, no clever line. I said I had a document she needed to see, and that I would sit at a table on neutral ground with no food on it. She came to the crossroads west of Katter 12 days later, at midday, in the open, alone, which she did not have to do, and which told me a good deal about her. She was 50, small, gray, with reading glass scars on the bridge of her nose from 30 years of close work with fine cord, and she looked exactly like somebody's aunt, which is presumably the point. I had a table put up on open ground with nothing on it. No pot, no bowl, no cup, no fire within 100 yards. I have never worked so hard in my life to make a table look like nothing. She sat down and said she had expected soup. I said I had thought about it for a week and had decided that offering her soup would be the single most insulting thing I could do to a woman who had kept one rule for 30 years. She said that was correct, and that it was also the first sensible thing anybody had said to her since spring. Then I put the warrant on the table, then the courier's docket, then the draft charter, open at section 4, with her guild's name in it in a clerk's hand. She read all 3 of them twice. She did not touch anything. She asked 2 questions, both about dates, and I answered both, and she checked the second one against a fold in the warrant paper. Then she sat back and said the contract was void, and gave me the reason in the guild's own words, and it was not gratitude, and it was not mercy. It was that a client destroying the guild while employing it is the exact case the rule was written for, and the rule is 140 years old, and she was not going to be the mistress who broke it. Then she told me what it cost her, and this is the part I did not see coming. She said a voided contract does not vanish. The guild collects from the defaulting party, which meant that, as of that afternoon, the Hollow Hand held a standing claim, in their own books, against the warden of the table personally. She said Krell would know within a month, that he would not be frightened by it for 1 second, and that his answer would arrive in the form of a document, because his answer always did. Then she stood up and said she would not eat at my table that day or any other, and that I should not take it personally. And she asked me one question before she got on her horse. She asked what I thought was going to happen when the crown finished writing. I said, an army. She said no. She said the empire had 4 armies and 40,000 clerks, and it had never once solved anything with the armies. She said Cadric III would not march on a cook. He would name one, and the naming would be the whole weapon, and I should think about what it would cost me when the man at the top of the world decided in public what I was. I rode back into Rotbrook that evening, feeling better than I had felt in 3 months. 387 bound, a voided contract, a warrant with a name on it, a road with 90 wagons a month on it, and a guild that owed the crown a debt. The 4 bound watchers went into the town the way everybody did, by trade and not by history. One of them could read 4 hands of script and went to Vask. One knew every roof in Ostvale and went to Rin. 2 of them asked for ordinary work and got it. And Mira Sedge wrote 4 more names above her line and did not write anybody below it that month, which had not happened since the spring. And she made a small noise about it that was almost approval. Mira Sedge was standing inside the gate waiting for me, which she never did, and she had her hands in her apron, and she did not say anything until I got down off the horse. Wen had not got up that morning. She had been carrying the ladle for 400 people twice a day for 19 months. She was 11 years old. She had a fever and she had not eaten anything at all in 2 days, and Mira had taken the slate off her and put her in the back room of the roadhouse. And when I came through the door, the first thing that girl said to me, out of a face I could not look at properly, was that she was sorry, and that she was hungry, and would I make her something. She asked me to make her something, that is all. A sick 11-year-old girl asked the best cook in the province for food, and he was standing 4 feet away with both hands empty. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Then I walked out of that room and down to a kitchen with 6 chimneys and 4 ovens and 1,100 bushels behind a locked door, and I stood in front of a cold hearth and struck a flint 9 times. 9 dead sparks on dry kindling in still air, exactly the same as a burned village and half a sack of hulled barley, 19 months earlier, over the same girl. I had a town. I had an army. I had 387 people who would walk into a river if I pointed at it. I had beaten a baron, a mercenary company, and a guild of assassins. And the rule I had been handed on the first morning had not moved 1 inch, and it never has, and it never will. For one who is not your enemy, the fire will not light. I am going to tell this properly, including the stretch where I was somebody I do not like, because leaving it out would make the rest of this dishonest. First, I tried the sensible thing, which was words. I sat down beside her and explained what the fire needed, and I asked her to say that she was my enemy. She said it, straight away without hesitating, in a voice with no strength left in it, because she would have said anything I asked her to say, and that is exactly why it did not work. The mark is not a word. It has never been a word. Sabin Krell burned her village and stood in my square and was not marked, because he did not care enough about me to be my enemy. You cannot declare it. You have to mean it. And an 11-year-old who has spent 2 years handing out bowls in the order children, sick, workers, bound cannot mean it about the person she made the order for. I tried twice more with different wording, because I am a stubborn man. The fire did not care. Then I did the other thing. I decided that if she could not be made to say it, she could be made to feel it. So I went back into that room with a plan, and I used every single thing I knew about that child, and I was extremely good at it, because I had been paying attention for 2 years. I told her the order of the line was a game we let her play. I told her the town humored her because she was small and it made a good story for the wagon men. I told her she had never once done a day of real work in Rotbrook. I got about 4 sentences in. She did not cry and she did not shout. She lay there and she looked at me and she said, in that thin voice, that she knew what I was doing and that it was not going to work and would I please stop. And then she said the thing that put me on the floor, which was that she was sorry that she could not do it for me. She was 11, she had a fever of 9 days, and she was apologizing to me for being unable to hate me enough to be fed. Mira Sedge took me out of that room by the arm, at 72 years of age, and she is not a large woman, and I went. She put me on a bench in the passage and stood in front of me and told me exactly what I had just done. She did not shout either. She said that Wen's mother had died in the lane in the spring of the fire, that Wen had watched it from under a cart, and that the child had built one single thing out of the wreck of it, which was a place at the middle of a town where she decided who ate first, and that I had just stood over her sickbed and told her it was a game. Then she took the larder key off her belt and put it in her apron and told me that I was not going into her stores in the state I was in, and I did not get it back for 6 days. Rin found me on the wall an hour later and did not say one single word about any of it, which was a great deal worse than being shouted at would have been. She stood there for a while, and then told me that in 12 years of soldiering, she had watched exactly 3 men do serious damage in a single afternoon, and all 3 of them had been frightened. Sir Dane said the only useful thing anybody said to me that day. He said the vow is not the enemy. He said I had spent 19 months treating the rule as a lock to be picked, and that a man who cannot open a door sometimes has to go and find out who else has hands. I want to record what the kitchen did during those 11 days, because people assume it was cruel to me, and it was not. It was worse than cruel. It carried on. It ran the counters. Cook level 10. Bound servants 387. Territory rank town. It offered me a task about a second holding with a clock on it. Twice, and I closed it both times without reading past the first line. It never once acknowledged that there was a girl in the back room of my roadhouse. It has no line for that. In 2 years, it never gave me a single word about anybody I loved, and I stopped expecting one somewhere in that passage on the 9th night. So I stopped trying to break the rule and started working the problem I actually had, which was a girl who had not eaten in 11 days. I put tasting on her. I had never once done it in 2 years because it felt like reading somebody's letters, and I did it that morning without hesitating, and I would do it again. It said, curd cheese with honey and crushed hazelnut, eaten in the morning. Not since she was 7 years old. Her name day. Her mother had made it on her name day twice, and then there had not been a third one. I could not make it. I could not have made it if the ingredients had been standing in front of me in a row, and they were, because we had all 4 of those things in the larder, and I had put 2 of them there myself. But Mira Sedge had taught Wen's mother to cook, in a village of 17 houses, in a district where everybody learns from the woman 2 doors up. Of course she had. She said she remembered the curd but not the proportion. She said agate always made it too sweet, and that she had told her so, and they had argued about it for 9 years. Too sweet. That is not nothing. That is a specification, and I have built entire menus on less. So I did the thing I had been doing every day for 2 years and had never once thought of as a skill. I stood at Mira Sedge's shoulder in the small kitchen at the back of the roadhouse, and I called it, the way I had called it at Gorse over a pot of horse bones in the ash, and she did the work with her own hands. Curd set warm and drained short, so it stays soft and does not squeak. Honey off the heat, never into it, because heat takes the flour out of honey and leaves you with sweetness and nothing else. Hazelnut toasted dry in the pan and crushed, not ground. Too sweet. On purpose. More honey than I would ever have used, because the woman who made it in that girl's memory made it too sweet, and had been told so, and had gone on doing it anyway. Then Mira Sedge carried it in, and I stood in the passage, and I did not go through the door, because a fevered child does not need a man in the doorway watching her eat. She ate about half of it. Then she was sick, and then she slept for 4 hours, and then at about 2 in the morning she ate the rest of it cold, on her own, and asked Hessa Loom whether there was any more. That was the turn. Not a miracle. A child with 11 days of fever kept something down, and after that it was broth and rest and Mira Sedge. And 9 days later, she was sitting up and rearranging the order of the line from a chair. And I still cannot feed her. That has never changed. It is the one wound in this entire story that stayed open, and I have decided to stop apologizing for having it. What I did about it afterward is the only part of that month I am willing to be proud of. I stopped being the only cook in Rotbrook. I had been running the largest kitchen in the province as though it were a stall, with everything in my hands, because I had come up from one cracked pot and had never once let go of the ladle. And I had just spent 11 days proving that if I were removed from that town by a fever or a bolt or a summons, 400 people would be standing in front of a cold hearth, waiting for somebody to strike a flint. So we built the school. 2 rooms off the back of the kitchen, benches, a low fire, and 11 apprentices in the first intake, chosen by Mira Sedge and Wen between them and not by me. I taught the way I was taught, which is badly and by shouting, and got better at it over about a year. Stock first, because everything is stock. Salt early. Never let a pot boil hard. Taste it at every stage, out loud, and say what it needs, because a cook who cannot say what a thing needs is only guessing quietly. Batch numbers, dates, the sample jar, and the flour book. All 11 of them learned the book before they learned the knife, and I have never had a fight about that with anybody who lived through the porridge. And this is the part that mattered, and that I did not see coming. My food binds. My apprentices cook the same dishes with the same method out of the same larder, and their food does nothing at all except feed people. Which meant that from that winter onward, Rotbrook could feed anybody. Friends, strangers, children, the 17, the sick, the the ones who had left a crust and walked out immune. 61 men from the siege, who I can never bind. And every one of them could sit down at my counter and be fed by a 14-year-old with a batch book, and 30 of them eventually did. That is what I built out of the worst week of my life. Not a weapon, a staff. The first intake was 11, 2 of the 17 from the fire, 4 children of deserters, 3 off the wagons, 1 of Tach's grandsons, and Bort, who cannot lift a full stock pot with that arm, and who turned out to have the best palate in the building. Bort found a bad batch of rye by smell alone in his 4th month, before it went anywhere near a pot, and Mira Sedge opened the sample jar, and he was right, and that boy walked about 8 inches taller for a year afterward. By the end of the second intake, there were 26 of them, and by the third, there were 40, and Rotbrook stopped being a place with a remarkable cook in it and became a place that produces cooks, which is a completely different kind of thing to try to destroy. Wen was the first apprentice on the list, and the only one who did not have to be taught the order of the line. By the following summer, she could put out a service of 300 with 2 helpers, and she started teaching the intake after hers before she was 13. She feeds me now. That is how it works in the end. I cannot cook one mouthful for that girl, and she has cooked several thousand for me, and neither of us has ever made a speech about it. Gorse came to me at the end of that first month, and asked, in the flat voice, whether he had done something wrong, because I had not given him an order in 9 days, and he had been managing the gate on the last one. I told him I was going to try to stop giving orders where a question would do. He said he did not think that would work. I said neither did I, and we left it there, and I have been failing at it in a better direction ever since. Pell put it more usefully. He said the town did not need me to carry the ladle. It needed me to be the reason there was a ladle, and that he had been saying so to Gorse for a year and had never worked out how to say it to me. And Sabin Krell published in the 3rd week of that winter, while I was teaching 11 children how to skim a stock. The Charter of Licensed Trades went out under seal to every province. 11 pages. Section 4 takes the guilds. Section 9 creates a register of persons whose craft affects the loyalty of subjects and requires them to hold a license issued by the warden of the table. There was exactly one name on the register when it was published. I have kept a copy of that page. It is the only document in my possession that spells my name correctly, and Krell wrote it himself, and I am fairly sure he enjoyed it. While all of that was happening, I did not walk the town for 11 days. I did not stand at the counter. I did not see who came to the morning service and who did not. I did not look at Halder. He had stopped eating on the 2nd day of Wen's fever, not refusing loudly, simply not being in the line, and being somewhere useful instead, which is a thing a mason with 19 years of foundations can arrange without anybody noticing at all. The bond does not break. Let me be completely clear about that, because people have told this part wrong for years. It does not break, it did not break, and it has never broken for anybody. But a bond fed twice a day for 2 years is not the same thing as a bond that has had nothing put into it since the frost. Halder had worked that out in a quiet way over a long time. The way he worked out everything, by measuring and by writing nothing down anywhere. 9 days without bread. That is what it takes. He had it exactly right, because he was the best builder in that province, and he never guessed at anything in his life. On the 9th night, he stood in the west wall for about a quarter of an hour and held his own hand still, and found that he could, and then he went back to his bed and told nobody. On the 10th morning, he came into the line, ate his breakfast, picked his tools up, and went back to work on the 2nd larder, and I did not notice that either. He had not decided anything that week. He had measured something. A man like Halder does not use a measurement until he knows exactly what it is for. And it took a tax officer with a company of unfeedable men another year and a half to tell him. 140 men came through the postern in the west wall at the 4th hour of a wet autumn night, and not one of them could be fed. That is the whole of it. That is the sentence Sabin Krell had been working toward since he put a bean on the rim of a bowl in a burned square. And he had spent the better part of 3 years assembling it, one man at a time, out of my own losses. Every soldier who ate at my counter and left a crust on the plate. Every guild enforcer who put a spoon of barley back in the pot and watched my face while he did it. 61 from the siege. 150 over the following 2 winters. All of them written in a ledger in Ostvale that was the exact twin of the one Mira Sedge kept on a board with a nail. He had gone and found them. He had paid them. He had made them a company with a warrant and a wage. And their own men called them the Crumbs, and they wore it on purpose. 140 professional soldiers against whom I am a man with a ladle. That is not a figure of speech. Against that company, I had no power of any kind. None. The one thing I can do in this world had been permanently taken away from every single one of them by their own choice years earlier on my own ground. And Halder opened the door. I am not going to write about him as a traitor because that word does the work of about 9 words, and all of them are wrong. He had been mine for 2 years and 5 months. He had built the wall, the gate, the larders, the water main, the granary, the school, the 2 rooms at the back where 11 children learned to skim stock. He had never once been asked whether he wanted to. And somewhere in the 2nd year, he had started measuring the one thing he had never been able to measure, which was himself, and writing nothing down. 9 days without bread. He had it exactly right. On the 9th day, the bond goes thin enough that a man can hold his own hand still and disobey. And he had proved that to himself a year and a half earlier, quietly. Over 9 days when there was not one person in that town looking at anybody except a sick girl. He drew the bolt at the 4th hour and stood back and let them through. And he had counted that right too. He had built the postern. He knew it took 6 men abreast if you took the inner step out, and he had taken the inner step out that afternoon. They came in fast, quiet, and professional, and the first thing they did was exactly the right thing, which was to make for the granary and the kitchen, and not for me. Krell's orders. Of course they were. He did not want me dead that night. He wanted 1,100 bushels and 6 chimneys, and he wanted a town of 900 to spend a winter finding out what I actually was without them. Gorse was on the north gate and got there in about 4 minutes with 30 men and had the sense to send a runner before he engaged rather than after. Rin Corval was in the roadhouse. She was on the west wall inside 6 minutes with the whole standing watch, and I found her there, and I gave an order, and the order was wrong. I told her to hold the granary. 1,100 bushels. Winter stores for 900 people. It was the largest thing I owned, and it was the thing they were closest to, and I said, hold the granary. And I said it in the voice, and every bound man on that wall turned to go and do it. And Rin Corval said no. She said it out loud, in front of 40 people, and then she put the whole watch on the school, and she left the granary to burn with 1,100 bushels in it. The school is 2 rooms and a low fire. There were 19 children asleep in the loft over it, because the second intake had come in that autumn, and there was nowhere else to put them until spring. I had not thought about the loft. I had a number in my head, and the number was 1,100, and I stood on my own wall and sent my only unbound officer to save grain. She got there about 90 seconds before they did. 90 seconds. Sir Dane came in on the flank with the horse a minute after that, and between them, they held the yard in front of those 2 rooms for about a quarter of an hour, and 19 children went out of the back window and over the bank into the second larder. That is what the whole night came down to. One person on my side who could still say no, and she said it at the only moment in 3 years when it mattered. We lost 13 people. I am going to name them, or at least the ones the story needs, because a number is how the Empire writes a village, and I have spent my life on the other side of that. Hessa Loom, widow, weaver, one of the 17 from the fire. She was 44. She went into the school loft to get the last 2 children out, and she got them out, and she did not come back through the window herself. Rannoch. 17 when he crossed the ford at dusk during the siege and cried the whole way through a bowl of barley. 20 when he died. He had been in the second cook intake for 4 months. He stood in the door of a kitchen with a stockpot lid and a knife and would not move. And I have been told by 3 people that he did not make a sound. 11 more. 4 bound, 7 free. And Mira Sedge wrote all 13 on the board above the line because she said they were on our side and the line was for something else. We lost the granary. All of it. 1,100 bushels went up and burned for 2 days, and the smell of it sat over that valley for a week, and it is a smell I would like to be able to forget. We did not lose the larders, because they are cut into a bank and roofed with earth, and a man with a torch cannot do anything to them at all. Halder had built them that way 3 years earlier, for damp. We did not lose the kitchen. 6 chimneys, 4 ovens, a stone building 110 feet long, and the worst of it was the roof over the north end and the counter, which took 2 months to put right. We did not lose the flour book, the batch jars, the school, the water main, the wall, the gate, the market, the road, or one single one of the 40 apprentices except Rannoch. And we did not lose the town. That is the thing Krell got wrong, and he was almost never wrong. He aimed at 1,100 bushels because he thought the town was a store, and the town was a staff. The crumbs pulled out at first light with about 40 carts of what they could take, in good order, with 14 dead of their own and nobody captured, because they were extremely good, and because Rin would not let anybody follow them into the dark. I found Halder at the postern at about the 6th hour. He had opened it and stood back, and then, at some point in the middle of it, when the schoolyard went up and he could see the 2 rooms he had built himself with the roof alight, he had changed his mind. He had gone into the gate hole with a lever bar, and the inner step he had taken out that afternoon, and tried to jam it shut with about 60 men still to come through, on his own, with one hand that had never been right since a block came down on it. They killed him in the hole, their own captain, from behind, without stopping, because he was an obstacle, and they were on a schedule. He was alive when I got there, and he had about a minute. He did not apologize, and I would have thought less of him if he had. He said the wall was sound, but the postern was a fault in it, and always had been, and that whoever rebuilt it should put the step on the outside, where a man cannot take it out without being seen from the tower. Then he asked me whether the children had got out, and I told him 19 out of 19, and he said good, and that was the end of it. We buried him at the top of the lane, in the gap, next to Dalm. Nobody argued about that either, which surprised me, and Mira Sedge put his name in the small column off to the side, the one she had started for Dalm and had never explained. She explained it that morning, finally, standing in the frost with a nail in her hand. She said the top of the board was for people I had won, and the bottom was for people I had lost forever. She said the side column was for the ones I had used up. I want to put down what I did in the 4 days after, because I had made an enormous mistake over a sick girl the year before, and I had promised myself something in a passage, and this was the test of it. I did not hunt anybody. I did not burn Catter, where 3 of the crumbs had been quartered. I did not touch the 2 market factors, who had certainly reported the postern, and one of them is still trading at Rotbrook, and still, I assume, reporting. And I did not give one order for 6 days, not one. I asked, every time. It was slow and it was awkward, and twice it produced a worse answer than I would have given. And I did it anyway until it stopped being a performance. On the 3rd day, I made Rin Corval marshal of the town over Gorse, and I did it in public at the counter. And I said the reason out loud in front of 400 people. I said I had ordered the granary held and she had refused, and that 13 people had died that night and it would have been 32, and that from that day the Marshal of Rotbrook had a standing right to refuse me in front of anybody. Gorse did not mind. Gorse cannot mind. That is the entire problem, and I said that out loud too. And it is the only time I have ever seen a room of 900 people go completely silent. One came and found me at the burned granary on the 2nd morning and stood next to me in the ash for a while, and then said that we had lost 1,100 bushels and not one cook, and asked which of those 2 things could be replaced by spring. She was 12. She had a slate in her hand with the winter ration on it, worked out already in her own writing, and she had it right to within about 9 bushels. We ate short that winter and nobody starved, because Dama Ostri put 4 grain wagons a week on the northern schedule at cost, and did not tell me she had done it until the 11th week, and because Vask sold a note I did not know he was holding. Then I sat down with Vask and asked him for a copy of the other ledger, because I had spent 3 years thinking of the leftover ledger as a wound, and it is not a wound, it is a list. 240 names of men who are permanently and absolutely safe from me, and a man who is safe from you is the only kind of man you can actually talk to. Reading it took up the next 2 years, and it is the reason there is anybody left alive at the end of this. I stopped trying to make the immune list smaller. I started reading it, where they came from, what they had done before, who they had left behind, what Krell was paying them, and what he had promised them, and in 14 cases, what he had failed to pay. Rin said it was the first thing I had ever done that a general would recognize. Dama Ostri said it was the first thing I had ever done that a merchant would recognize. Sirah 9, when she heard about it a year later, said something ruder and more useful, and then sent me 9 pages of it that Vask had not been able to get. And I sent 1 letter to Sabin Krell at the office of the warden of the table, by ordinary post, unsealed, so that 30 clerks would read it on the way. 4 lines. I told him the granary was gone and the school was standing. I told him the count of my dead and the count of his. I told him that his company was excellent and that his captain had killed a man from behind who was trying to help him. And then I told him that there were 240 names on his list and that I had begun writing to all of them. I have been told he read it twice and then filed it, which from that man is roughly the same as shouting. We had the granary out and the roof off the north end of the kitchen by the 4th day, and we were rebuilding. And the whole valley smelled of 1,100 bushels of burned rye and 2 days of pyres. And on the 6th morning, out of a clear cold sky, something came down onto the ridge above the oak stand that made every horse in that town scream at once. Ash drakes follow burned ground. That is what they eat. Everything in a fire that dies of the fire, and everything that comes to a fire afterward, and they can smell a burned granary from about 40 miles. It was 90 feet long from the nose to the last of it, and it was the color of a cold hearth. It settled on the ridge road exactly where 3 bandits had come down it 3 years earlier, and it looked down into my valley at 900 people, 2 larders, 40 carts of ash, and 1,100 bushels of grain that had already been cooked for it. And the page in the corner of my eye opened one line, calm as anything, the way it had opened for Gorse and for Krell and for a herald with a white staff. Enemy detected. Rin Corvale put it to me in one sentence on the wall on the first morning, and it is the best summary of my entire life that anybody has ever produced. She said I had one attempt, and that if it left so much as a bone, I would have a permanently unbindable dragon living on my ridge for the rest of my life and the rest of my children's lives. That is what nobody outside ever understood about the failure rule. It is not a setback. It does not reset. Sabin Krell was a man with a spoon, and he had cost me a barony, and Skorath was 90 feet long. So we did not do anything at all for 12 days, and I want to be clear that not doing anything was the hardest work of the whole business. It did not attack. That was the first surprise. It came down onto the ridge, and it went to the burned granary, and it ate the burned granary. Ash drakes eat fire ground, not people, not cattle in a field, not anything that runs. They eat what a fire leaves: char, clinker, cooked grain, scorched bone, the mineral in burned earth. That is their whole trade, and there had not been one in that province in 60 years because nobody had burned anything worth 40 miles of flying. 1,100 bushels of burned rye and 2 days of pyres had put a signal into the sky that a creature like that can read the way I read a stockpot. It cleared the granary floor in a night and a day. Then it started on the burned quarter of the schoolyard. Then it went up onto the old fire ground from the first spring, 3 years cold, and dug the top 8 inches off 2 acres, and ate that as well. And then it was finished, and it stayed. And that is when it became a problem, because a thing that big with nothing left to eat has to make a decision. I sent Pell and 2 others out to watch it, on foot, at distance for a fortnight. Pell came back with something on the 4th day that turned the whole thing around, and it was the kind of thing only a poacher notices. He said it never took anything green. He had watched it walk past sheep. He had watched it lie 10 feet from a live ox and not look at it. It had gone 40 yards out of its way around a standing hedge. So I went up the ridge myself with Ser Dane and about 180 yards of good sense, and I stood on the burned ground below it, and I opened tasting on a creature the size of a barn. I did not expect the skill to work at all. It worked, and it gave me one line, and the line was longer than any line it had ever given me for a person. It said, "It has never eaten anything that was not already destroyed." 200 years, perhaps more, and every single thing that had gone into that animal had been burned, dead, spoiled, cracked, or ruined before it got there. It had never once in its life eaten anything that somebody had made on purpose. Nobody cooks for a drake. Why would they? You either kill it or you leave the district. And standing on that burned ground with a page of light over a creature the size of a barn, I stopped being frightened and started being interested, which Rin has told me on several occasions is the most dangerous thing about me. Then came the actual problem, and it took Ren Otter, Halder's foreman, Wick, Rin and me 6 days at a table to solve. And we solved it wrong twice before we solved it right. The rule says the portion must be finished to the last bite. A drake does not eat. A drake scoops. It takes a mouthful of ground 11 feet across and everything in it. And what it does not swallow it leaves smeared over half an acre. If I laid a meal out on open ground, that animal would take 90% of it in one go and leave a strip of it in the grass, and the page would say portion not completed, and I would have failed forever on the largest enemy I would ever be given. Second problem, it only eats what has been destroyed by fire, which meant the food had to be genuinely burned and genuinely mine, and burned food is the one thing a cook spends his whole life avoiding. The second problem I actually enjoyed. It is only technique. You can cook something to black on the outside and perfect inside if you go slowly enough and seal it well enough. And every country in the world has a version of it, and the version I know is a pit. Dig a pit, line it with stone, burn a fire in it for 6 hours until the stone is white. Rake it, wrap the food, bury it, cap it with earth, and leave it for 2 days. And what comes out is charred on every surface and falling apart underneath. So we built the biggest thing I have ever cooked. A whole ox, 2 whole pigs, 60 pounds of salt, because a creature that has eaten mineral out of burned earth for 2 centuries is a creature that knows what salt is, even if it has never had it clean. Rendered fat. 6 bushels of the rye that had already been half burned in the granary, which was the one part of it that made everybody laugh, because I was serving the dragon, the thing that had called it. Ramson, thyme, and about 40 pounds of honey out of Katter, because I had one piece of evidence and I used it. Nothing that eats ash has ever had anything sweet. And then there was the first problem, which is the one that actually mattered, and which was solved by a blacksmith and not by me, and not by anybody at that table with an opinion about food. Ren Otter said, in the flat, obliging voice, that if the trouble was the animal leaving a smear on the ground, then the answer was not to put anything on the ground. He built a drum. Iron plate over an oak frame, 11 feet long, 6 across, hooped, sealed at both ends with a clay lute, on skids, with 2 rings on the top of it so a team could drag it. The whole meal went inside it. Every ounce. Nothing on a table, nothing on a board, nothing anywhere in the open. One sealed object, cooked in the pit for 2 days with the drum itself in the fire, so that the outside of it was as black as everything else on that ridge. Then, 12 oxen dragged it up the ridge road at dawn and cut the traces at 80 yards, and everybody walked away, and I stood on the burned ground on my own like an idiot, because it is my portion, and I serve it. I did not offer it. I have never offered anything to anybody since a lieutenant told me not to in a ditch on the river road, and I was not going to start with a creature the size of a barn. I stood at the edge of the burned acre with my hands behind my back and let 4 miles of aroma come off a sealed iron drum that had been in a fire pit for 2 days. Skorath came down off the rock in about the way a cliff would if you asked it to. It went round the drum 3 times. It put its face against it. There is a sound that a thing like that makes when it breathes in that I do not have a word for, and I have stopped trying to find one. And then it took the whole drum in one movement, off the ground, hoops, skids, clay, oak, iron and all, and the ground where the drum had been was bare, and there was nothing left on that ridge at all. The page opened, and then it did not say anything. It sat there, open, blank under the line, for 4 hours. I have never had that happen before or since. I have had it say bound, and I have had it say failed, and both of those arrive inside a breath. That page sat open over a ridge in the afternoon light and did not resolve, and I sat on a rock below it and did not move. Rin came up at the 2nd hour and sat with me, Sir Dane at the 3rd. Nobody said anything useful. Rin eventually said that it was probably arguing with itself about whether a thing swallowed inside a drum counted as eaten, and she was joking, and she was also right. At the 4th hour, Skorath stood up, made a sound I felt through the rock, and spat out the iron. 11 hoops and about 200 weight of plate, in a heap, 40 yards down the slope. Perfectly clean. Not a mark on it except the seam splits. And in among the hoops, caught in the bend of one of them, wedged where the drum had folded when it went down, there was one rib off an ox, charred black, about 2 feet long, with meat still on it, sitting on a hillside outside the animal. I have not been that frightened in my life, including in the ditch, including on the night of the postern. That rib was the whole of it. One piece of my portion, not eaten, lying on open ground, and a page above me that had not closed. Rin had her hand on my arm and was telling me not to go down the slope, and she was right, and I was going to go down the slope, because I have never in my life been able to leave a plate half cleared. I got about 6 steps. Then Skorath came down the hill past me, close enough that the wind of it put me on the ground, and it put its nose into the heap of iron and turned the hoops over with its face like a man going through a drawer. It found the rib. It ate the rib, and it did it the way a man goes after the last chip in the bottom of the bag, with his whole hand in, and no dignity about it at all. It went back through the whole heap twice more in case there was another one, and then it sat down in the middle of 200 weight of scrap iron on a burned hillside, and it made a noise, and the noise was unmistakably a complaint that there was not any more. 200 years of eating ash, and the first time anybody had ever cooked for it on purpose. It went back through the wreckage looking for the piece it had missed. Engineering did not close that portion. Appetite closed it. Appetite has closed every single one of them, from 3 bandits in a road to the last man in this story, and I should have known better than to think a dragon would be the exception. The page said one word, and I lay on my back on a burned ridge and laughed until my ribs hurt. Bound. Bound servants, 388. Bound servant, Skorath. Ash Drake. Age unknown. Skill, flight, haulage, ground clearance, and controlled burning. Assigned to territory as transport and works. Transport and works. That is what the kitchen made of 90 feet of dragon. I have read that line perhaps 400 times, and it has never once stopped being funny. Wen was 12. She came up the ridge road that evening with 2 helpers and a barrow, looked at a creature that had eaten a granary, and put it at the end of the order of the line, after everybody else, because it had not done any work yet. It accepted that. I do not know what else to tell you. It has held that place in the order for 11 years, and it has never once tried to move up, and it eats last, and Wen still writes it on the slate in the same hand she uses for everybody else. What that animal gave us in the first month was not fire and it was not fear, and nobody expected the actual answer, which was distance. That animal can carry a loaded cart from Rotbrook to Ello Ford in about the time it takes to walk to the ford, and to Catter before noon, and it can put a sealed message in the capital in a day and a half, which meant I could run a kitchen in 3 places at once. Morning service at Rotbrook, evening at Catter, and back. And a town is not a wall or a granary. A town is a place where the food arrives. The other thing it gave us was that nobody attacked anything for 14 months. Not one raid, not one enforcer, not one license inspection. Rin said it was the most expensive piece in the empire and worth every card of it. And Mira Sedge, who was 72 that year and had buried a husband, a village, a widow, and a mason, walked up the ridge road on her own 2 legs to look at it and came back down and said it was a very large animal and that its teeth wanted seeing too. Ello Ford asked to come in that autumn, by vote, at a meeting I was not at. Catter followed in the spring, after a winter of watching us feed their poor with a school of 40 apprentices and no conditions attached. Territory rank advanced, town to domain, 2 holdings that feed themselves, and a 3rd by the following summer. And the bottleneck came with it, the way it always did, and this one has never gone away. Skorath eats a cart every 11 days. Not a small cart. That is roughly the surplus of 1 good farm, forever, for the rest of my life, and probably for the rest of my grandchildren's. We pay it. We built 2 more pit ovens for it. 900 people happily feed a dragon because the dragon carries their grain, and I put that in the ration book in my own hand as a standing item, and Mira Sedge audited it twice a year until she died. And 2 months after Skorath went into the order of the line, a rider came up the Ost Road from the south with a sealed letter and a face the color of paper. An imperial field army had crossed the provincial boundary at Harrow Weir. 9,000 men under General Owain Rask with a siege train, an engineer corps, and a wagon line 11 miles long. They were not coming for a rebel town, because towns do not get 9,000 men. They were coming because a subject of Cadric III had been reported, in writing, by the warden of the table, to be in possession of a dragon. Rin Corvale worked out what Rask's army actually was on the second evening, standing at the ration board with a piece of charcoal, and when she finished explaining it, I had to go outside. 9,000 men, fed properly, paid on time, imperial standing orders, which by then were Sabin Krell's 6 rules, with 4 more added and a flogging attached to each. Order 9, which Rin read to me off a captured copy in a voice with nothing in it at all. Where food is taken from the enemy of the crown, no portion shall be finished. A quantity shall be left in every vessel. 9,000 men under written orders to leave a bite. If I rolled a service out onto that field and every man on it ate, I would make 9,000 people permanently immune to me in a single afternoon. 240 names on Mira Sedge's board had taken Krell 3 years to collect. Owain Rask had brought me 9,000 in 11 miles of wagons, and all I had to do to hand Krell his entire life's work was the thing I am best at. That is the trap, and it was beautiful, and I want to say plainly that Sabin Krell built it. Rask was a soldier with orders. The orders were a kitchen. So the question stopped being how do I feed 9,000 men, and became who on that field is not under those orders. I will deal with the dragon first, because everybody asks, and because it is the shortest part of this. I did not use it. Rin asked me to. She made the case properly, in front of Dain and Gorse and Vask, and the case was that 9,000 men in tents in a dry autumn is 1 pass of that animal, and the province is finished with sieges forever. I said no. Dain said no with me. Rin said she had expected that, and had made the case anyway, because somebody has to. And then she went and worked the actual problem harder than anybody, which is what she always did. I have never used Skorath on a person, and I never will. And the reason is not that I am good. The reason is that the day I burn 9,000 men, everything I built stops being a kitchen and starts being a throne with a story attached. What Skorath did in that campaign was carry pit ovens. Now, 11 miles of wagons. An imperial field army of 9,000 is not 9,000 people. It is 9,000 soldiers and about 4,000 others, and the 4,000 others are the reason the 9,000 can stand up. Carters, farriers and their boys, ostlers, wheelwrights, sawyers and the engineer corps timber train, cooks and their cooks, watermen, 240 contractors and their drivers, wives, sisters, mothers, children, and the whole slow river of people who follow an army because the army is where the money is. Not one of them is a soldier. Not one of them is under military orders. Every single one of them is on a contract or on nothing at all, and the Imperial Commissariat had been 14 weeks late with the northern payments since spring. That was my doing too. 3 years earlier and by accident. Vask had taught 4 merchant houses that graphene paper was a bad idea, and habits like that spread outward through a ledger, the way damp spreads through a wall. Ovain Rask had marched into my domain, with an army that could not be starved and a supply train that had not been paid since the barley harvest. We laid the kitchen out on the flat below the mill weir on the 4th morning, 4 miles from Rask's line, directly across the road his wagons had to use, on open ground, in daylight. Not a stall, not a counter. A road station 1,100 feet long. 9 pit ovens dug in a row and fired the night before. 200 feet of trestle. 40 apprentices in 2 shifts, and every one of them cooking food that binds nobody at all, because that is the point of apprentices. And in the middle of it, 1 counter with 1 man behind it, and behind him 4 drums off Ren Otter's forge, and the whole of my own hand. The page opened while the last trestle was going in, the way it always did, because that machine has always had a very good sense of when I have committed to something I cannot undo. Territory rank domain. Skill unlocked long table. A table you have laid is 1 table. Every portion served from it is your portion, wherever it is finished. That skill changed the size of my life. Up to that morning, I had to hand a man a cup. From that morning, anything I cooked and put on my own table was mine, and it stayed mine down 11 miles of road. I put out 4,011 portions in 9 hours. I want to set down what that actually is, because it is the only genuinely impossible thing I have ever done, and I did not do it alone. 3 services of 120 on the counter every quarter of an hour. 10 hours, and behind me 40 apprentices moving food onto the trestle at the same rate, and when, at the end of it, with a slate, deciding the order of the line for an imperial supply train. Children first, then the sick, then the working, then everybody else. She would not move off it for a paymaster's clerk who tried to buy his way up, and there is a man in Ostvale today who tells that story about himself. Not 1 soldier. That was the whole discipline of that day, and holding it was harder than the cooking, and the cooking nearly killed me. Sir Dane stood at the head of the line for 9 hours and turned back every man in imperial colors who came down that road, and there were about 90 of them, and one of them cried. I could not feed him. He was under orders. If he ate and left a bite, I lost him forever, and he did not know that, and I could not explain it to him in a line of 4,000 people. So I let a knight send a soldier away, hungry, and I have thought about that man since. The carters ate. The farriers ate. The engineer corps timber train ate to a man, 62 of them, and then sat down on their own wagons and did not get up. Bound servants, 4,398. Cook level 14. That number is a joke. It is a number out of a story. I had 1,100 bushels burned in a granary 2 years earlier, and now I had a counter longer than a village, and a bound population larger than most towns in that province. And it did not win anything by itself. That is the part that matters. 4,000 carters do not beat 9,000 soldiers. What they did was stop. On the 5th morning, the timber train did not move. On the 6th, the water wagons did not come up. On the 7th, the farriers were gone, and there are about 11,000 horseshoe nails a week in an army that size, and no army in the world carries 11,000 horseshoe nails. Rask's men were fed for 9 days. They had orders, morale, wages, and a siege train. They also had no water beyond what was in the camp, no forage carts, no timber for the engineers, and a road behind them with 4,000 people sitting on it who would not be moved by anything except a massacre. He could have ordered the massacre. He had 9,000 men, and I had 4,000 carters and 1,100 fighting people behind a wall. He did not, and I will say why. Because it was not mercy. It was that a general who kills 4,000 imperial contractors on an imperial road does not get to go home either. He came down to the counter on the 11th day, alone, in the afternoon, with his helm under his arm, and his sword left with his horse at 80 yards, which nobody had asked him to do. Ovan Rask was about 60 years old, and had commanded in the eastern campaigns for 12 of them, and he did not look like a man who had lost anything. He was the sort of man who looks at a thing for a long time before he says anything about it, and he stood at the end of my counter and looked down 1,100 feet of trestle at 4,000 people eating. Then he asked me one question. He asked whether I had built the road station before or after I had read his standing orders. I said after. I said I had built it because his orders made his soldiers unreachable and had left his wagons standing in the open, and that I had spent 9 days working out how not to feed his army. He thought about that for a while. Then he said the thing that ended the campaign, and he said it like a man reading a return. He said that in 12 years he had never lost an engineer corps, and that he had lost this one to a queue. I put a bowl on the counter and stepped back with my hands behind me, because I do not break my own rules and because he was marked, and I would have been a fool not to. He looked at it for a long moment, and he did not touch it, and I did not expect him to. Then he told me why, and it was better than Krell's reasons, and I have never been able to argue with it. He said his men were under an order that he had signed. He said he would not eat where he had forbidden them to eat, and that if he did it once, in private, on a road, it would be in every barracks in the empire inside a month, and he would have taken something from 9,000 people that he could not give back. Then he asked for terms, formally, in the field, with a clerk of his own writing it down, and I gave him the only ones I actually wanted. The army withdrew south of Harrow Weir. Every contractor on that road was paid in full out of the imperial chest before a single wagon moved, in coin, at the counter, in front of witnesses, and Yesen Vask counted it. Nobody was pursued, nobody was hanged, and no man in imperial colors was fed on either side of that boundary, which was Rask's condition and not mine, and which I kept. And in exchange, he asked me for one thing, and he asked for it standing up, in the open, in front of about 20 of my people and none of his. He said he could not ride south and report that a field army of 9,000 had been disassembled by a cook and a queue, and simply leave the cook standing in a field. He said the emperor had issued a summons in the spring, through the office of the warden of the table, and that it had never been served because nobody could work out how to serve it. And he asked me to come south to Ostvale and answer that summons standing on my own 2 legs, in front of the man who had issued it. Rin said no. Gore said no. Vask produced 6 separate reasons involving law, and Sira 9, who had come north that autumn and was sitting at the end of my counter eating nothing, said the shortest and worst one, which was that a summons served in person is not a summons. It is a delivery. Dane Aylward said yes, and Wen said yes, and they said it for the same reason and about 4 seconds apart. Wen said it plainly, at 13, with the slate still in her hand. She said that we had spent 4 years making people come to us, and that everybody who came had to walk the last part on their own, and that this was the first time it had been my turn. I told Rask I would come in the spring. He said that was acceptable and got on his horse, and 11 miles of wagons started rolling south the next morning with 4,000 people on them who now belonged to me and who were going home with wages in their hands. Mira Sedge did not put 4,000 names on her board, because there was not a board in the province that size. She put the number, and then she put the second number underneath it, and the second number was not. Not one person left a bite on that road in 9 hours. 4,011 portions, 4,011 clean plates, because a hungry carter who has not been paid since the barley harvest is not under anybody's standing orders about anything. She looked at that knot for a while, and then said that it was the first day in 4 years that the bottom of her board had not moved. And then she went and sat down, and she was 73, and she had been on her feet since 4 in the morning. That is how the Empire found out, not from a spy and not from a battle. From 4,000 paid carters going home to 14 provinces with the same story in their mouths. And on the 9th day of that spring, in the Hall of Accounts at Ostvale, Cadric III stood up in front of his court and named me out loud. He said the greatest threat to the crown was not an army, a rebellion, or a plague. He said it was one man in the north who fed people, and he ordered his name entered in the Book of Enemies of the Crown, in the Emperor's own hand, as the first entry on a new page. And 400 miles away, in a kitchen, in the middle of the morning service, with a ladle in my hand and 40 apprentices working behind me, the page in the corner of my eye opened up and lit. Enemy detected. Cadric III, Emperor. The Book of Enemies of the Crown is real. It is not a figure of speech, and it is not a list kept by a clerk. It is a book, bound in black calf, and it lives on a stand in the Hall of Accounts at Ostvale, and it is 411 years old. They let me look at it. That was the first thing that told me I was in serious trouble, because you do not show a man the book unless you have already decided he is not leaving. My name is on a new page in the Emperor's own hand, on its own, with nothing above it and nothing below it, and the entry underneath the name says, "He feeds them." 3 words. Cadric III wrote them himself, and they are the only entry in that entire book that is not a charge of treason, rebellion, murder, heresy, or war. And the moment he wrote it, 400 miles north, in the middle of a morning service with a ladle in my hand, the page in the corner of my eye lit up and gave me the throne. Enemy detected. Kadrik III, Emperor. 4 years. A tax officer, a baron, a mercenary company, a guild, an army, and a dragon. And none of them had opened that door. He opened it himself, with a pen, in front of his whole court, because he was frightened of me and because he was right to be. I went south in the spring, on my own legs, as I had told Ovain Rask I would. I took Serdane Aylward, yes, and Vask, 2 clerks, and nobody else, no soldiers. Not Rin, because Rin had a domain to hold, and because she was the only person who could refuse me, and I was walking into a place where that was going to be needed at home, rather than beside me. Rotbrook ran for 4 months without me, and ran better. And I have never once pretended that was not the whole point of the school. Ostvalle is a city of about 90,000 people. I had never seen 90,000 people. I stood on the Ost Bridge for a while like a farmer, and Diane waited and did not say anything about it, which is one of about 40 reasons I loved that man. They did not arrest me. That surprised everybody, including Krell, and it took me 9 days to understand why. They received me. Lodgings in the chancery, a clerk assigned, meals sent up which I did not eat because I am not stupid, and an examination that ran for 3 weeks in a room with 14 people writing. Because a court does not want to kill a thing it does not understand. It wants to write it down first. That is what a chancery is for. Lord Chancellor Omri Falk conducted most of it. He was 60, courteous, and about 4 times cleverer than Sabin Krell in every direction, except the one that mattered, which is that Falk wanted to be right and Krell wanted to be finished. They asked me 900 questions, and I answered every single one of them honestly. And Vask told me 20 times that I was insane, and I did it anyway for the same reason I had let the merchants write their letters. Then, on the 22nd day, I was taken to a small room with a fire in it and 1 table, and Kadrik III came in with 2 guards and sent the guards out. He was 35. He had his father's chin and a bad shoulder and ink on his fingers, which I noticed because I had spent 4 years learning what ink on a man's fingers means. He did not sit. He said he had 1 question, and that he had been carrying it since a general came south and reported the loss of an engineer corps to a queue. He asked me whether I had ever fed a man who did not want to be fed. I said no. I told him about Rin's rule and about the terms and about Serdane at the head of the line for 9 hours. I told him I had never once put a bowl into a man's hands, that I stepped back from every plate, that I told every single person what would happen before they ate. And then he made the case against me, and I want to write it down properly, because most people who tell this story make him a fool, and he was not a fool. And it is the only argument I have never been able to answer. He said that was worse. He said a tyrant who lies can be exposed. A poisoner can be caught. A man who compels people by force leaves a mark that everybody can see and hate. He said I told the truth, stepped back and let a hungry man choose, and that the man chose, and that afterward the man could not choose anything ever again. He said that a person who has just eaten the best food of his life at the hands of somebody who was honest with him will not experience the binding as a chain. He will experience it as gratitude, and there is no way in the world to get him back out. He said the empire is held together by 10,000 men who obey orders they dislike, and that this is not a beautiful thing, but that every one of them can in principle stop. And then he said the sentence that is written on the wall of my own kitchen now, in my own hand, because I decided that if it was going to live in my head, it could live where people could see it. He said that I had not conquered anybody. He said I had abolished the possibility of being talked out of it. I did not have an answer. I have never had an answer. I said the only true thing available to me, which was that I had not chosen the rule and could not change 1 word of it, that I had refused to break it 6 times when breaking it would have been easier, and that 4,398 people had walked into it with their eyes open, and not one of them had been hungry since. He said that was a very good answer for a cook and a very bad answer for a man with a dragon. Then he told me what he was going to do, and it was not an execution, and it was much worse. He was going to license me, the Register of Persons, Section 9 of Krell's Charter. I would hold a warrant, cook under the table, be housed, paid, protected, and never leave the capital again, and every man I bound would belong to the crown by warrant. Rotbrook would be chartered, pardoned, and taxed. Nobody would burn anything. Wen, Rin, Gorse, the school, the market, the road, all of it, safe forever. And the price was 1 man in 1 building in Ostvale for the rest of his life. He offered me the same thing Sabin Krell had offered me in a burned square 4 years earlier. And I noticed that, and so did Krell, who was standing against the wall the whole time and did not say a single word. I asked for 11 days to think about it. I was given 9. And in those 9 days, 2 things happened that decided the rest of it. The first is that Sira 9 came to my lodging by a route I still do not understand, and put 4 pages on the table, and did not sit down. The hollow hand keeps records of every execution carried out under imperial warrant, going back to the founding because the guild's whole legal existence rests on the distinction between a killing and a sentence. And there is a custom attached to an imperial capital sentence, and it is 400 years old, and it is called the last table. When the crown puts a man to death by the emperor's own warrant, and not by a court's, the emperor eats the condemned man's final meal with him, at one table, in the hall, in public. It is not mercy. It is the opposite. The point of it is that the emperor cannot hide behind a clerk. If he kills a man personally, by his own hand and his own warrant, he sits down with him first, and afterward, everybody in the hall has watched him do it. There is a second provision, older and shorter, and it is a working man's line. A condemned man of a victualling trade may prepare his own last meal, in the hall kitchen, under watch, with his own hands, because a craftsman's last day belongs to his craft. 400 years of that provision sitting on a page, and in 400 years not one condemned baker, brewer, or cook had ever mattered enough to anybody for it to be used. Sira 9 put those 4 pages down and told me that Krell had read the same records in the winter, and that he had put a paper before the chancellor in the 2nd week of spring asking that the last table be set aside as an obsolete formality. And the chancellor had refused, in writing, and Omri Falk's reason is the finest thing anybody in that whole court ever did. He wrote that a sentence which the emperor will not sit down with is a sentence he should not sign. That is the entire ending of this story, and it was written by a 60-year-old lawyer who disliked me in a memorandum about procedure 4 months before anybody needed it. She also told me what it would cost, because Sira 9 is the only person I have ever met who leads with the price and then waits to see what your face does. She said a capital sentence under the emperor's own warrant is not something a man can ask for, only something he can earn, and that there is no version of it where he is not going to die. She said the custom guarantees a table. It does not guarantee anything after the table. 400 years of records, and in every single one of them, the man at the last table was dead before the next morning. I said I understood. She said I did not, and that men who say that sentence in the spring always look different in the autumn, and then she left the way she had come in. The second thing that happened in those 9 days is that I went out and walked the Low City on the 3rd morning, because I had been in a chancery room for 3 weeks, and I wanted to look at a market. Ostfale has 90,000 people in it, and about 14,000 of them were hungry that spring, because the northern payments had been late for a year and a half, and because a city is a place where being poor is more expensive than anywhere else. There were 400 people queuing at a temple door for a bread dole that had run out at the 9th hour, and there were 9 children in that queue, and I stood across the street and watched it for about an hour. And then I went back to my lodging and wrote north. And 12 days later, Skorath came over the Ost with a cart under it and set 40 apprentices, 6 drums, 9 ovens, and Wen down in a yard by the fish market, and we opened a kitchen. No license. Under the charter, for a person on the register, that is a capital offense, and I knew it before I wrote the letter, and Vask told me the section number twice. We ran that yard for 11 days. I did not cook. That is the part Krell had not thought about, and that Falk understood on the first morning. And it is the reason none of it could be stopped quietly. 40 apprentices cooked. 14-year-olds from a burned village, working 2 shifts off a batch book, with samples in stoppered jars and dates cut into every barrel head, and their food does not bind anybody at all. It is only food. I stood at the end of the counter and washed pots. That is what I did for 11 days in the imperial capital. 200 pots, a service, in a tub, with my sleeves rolled, and about 9,000 people came through that yard, and every single one of them saw the man from the Book of Enemies of the Crown, up to his elbows in dishwater. Wen ran the order of the line. She was 14. Children first, then the sick, then the working, then everybody else. In a city of 90,000 people, it took her about 4 days to become the most argued about person in Ostvale. Dane Aylward stood at the head of that queue in Ostvale the way he had stood at the head of one at a ford, and told every single person the terms before they went in. About 1,100 of them laughed at him, because nobody was being bound by anything at all, and he told them that as well, in the same voice, every time. That was the point. That was the whole point, and it took the city about 4 days to understand it. The most dangerous man in the empire had come to the capital and had opened a kitchen where nothing happened to you at all. Vask kept the accounts and posted them on a board in the yard every evening, in charcoal, the way we do everything. Grain in, cost per portion, portions served, who had given what? 9,000 people in 11 days, and the whole thing on a board where a child could check it. By the 6th day, there were carters bringing us grain at cost. By the 8th, there were 2 of the Imperial Road Guard standing at the mouth of the yard, keeping the queue straight on their own time and out of uniform. By the 11th, there were 1,100 people in the street, and the Chancery could not pretend it was not happening. And Sabin Krell came into that yard with a warrant party at 4 in the afternoon during the evening service. He did not shout. He never shouted. He stood in front of a counter with his case under his arm, and he read the section aloud, correctly, and there was not one word in it that was wrong. Then he had me arrested for feeding people without a license, in front of 1,100 of them, and I want to be completely clear that I had spent 9 days making certain that he would. I put the pot I was holding in the tub. I dried my hands on the cloth. Wen did not stop serving because I had told her not to, and she has told me since that it was the hardest thing anybody has ever asked her to do. And as they took me out of that yard through 1,100 people who had just eaten, I looked back at the man in the gray coat, standing alone at the end of a counter in a city where everybody else was chewing. He was writing. They tried me in the Hall of Accounts, under the stand with the black book on it, in front of about 400 people, and the whole thing took 11 days, and I lost it on purpose. Sabin Krell prosecuted. Omri Falk presided. Kadric III sat above and to the left and did not speak once in 11 days, and I could see his hands. The charge was correct. That is the thing I have never been able to make anybody outside understand. Krell did not lie about one word of it. I was on the register. I had cooked in Ostvale without a warrant. 9,000 portions in 11 days, and Vask had put the number on a board in charcoal himself. Krell's case took 4 days, and it was the best piece of work that man ever did. He did not call me a monster. He called 11 witnesses, and every one of them said something true and good about me, and he let them, and then he asked each of them one question at the end. He asked them whether they could imagine changing their mind about me. 9 of them said no. 2 of them said no, and then said it again, in case the first one had not been heard. That was the case. He did not need anything else. 9 free men in an imperial court, none of them bound, saying that they could not conceive of being talked out of me. My defense took 2 days and Vask ran it, and it was accounts. Grain in, cost per portion, portions served, and the second board, which nobody in that hall had ever seen and which I had asked him to bring. 241 names under a line. Every person in 4 years who had eaten my food, left something, and become permanently free of me. Vask read all 241 names into the record, slowly, with the trades, and it took him about 90 minutes, and Falk led him, and I have never worked out whether that was fairness or cruelty, and I suspect Falk had not either. Owain Rask testified on the 8th day, and nobody had asked him to. He came south from Harrow Weir on his own initiative and stood in that hall in uniform. He told the court that his standing orders had cost him an engineer corps, that he had signed those orders with his own hand, and that he no longer believed the men who wrote them understood what an army actually eats. He looked at Krell when he said the last part. That is the only time in this entire story that anybody in a position of power did that to Sabin Krell in public, and it cost Rask a command. And on the 9th day, I stood up and pleaded guilty to everything, and refused the license in open court in a voice that carried. I want to record what I said, because it was not brave and it was extremely deliberate. I said the Emperor had offered me a warrant, a house, a wage, and the safety of my town in exchange for staying in one building for the rest of my life, and that I had thought about it for 9 days, and the answer was no. I said that if they let me out of that hall, I would open a kitchen in Ostvale again the following week, and then in Katter, and then in every city on the Ost without a license for as long as I could stand up. I said the charter made that a capital offense, and that the capital penalty under Section 9 requires the Emperor's own hand and cannot be signed by a chancellor or a court. And then I asked him for it. Out loud, in front of 400 people, I asked Kadric III to sign the warrant himself. The hall went completely quiet, and Omri Falk put his pen down very carefully, because Falk was the cleverest man in that room, and he had my whole plan about 4 seconds before anybody else did. Sabin Krell had it about 2 seconds after Falk did, and he came up out of his chair faster than I had ever seen that man move in 4 years. He asked the court to strike the customary provisions attached to an imperial warrant as obsolete. He had the paper ready. He had had it ready since the 2nd week of spring. Falk refused it from the bench in 2 sentences and then read his own memorandum of the previous spring into the record. He wrote that a sentence which the Emperor will not sit down with is a sentence he should not sign. He had written that 4 months before there was any reason to. He had written it because he was a lawyer, and it was correct, and it undid the whole of Krell's life, and Falk did not enjoy it. And that is what makes him different from every other person in this account. The emperor signed on the 10th day. I was sentenced to death by the crown's own warrant, to be carried out on the 4th morning following, and the last table was set for the evening before. And then the second provision was read, and I was granted the right to prepare my own last meal, in the hall kitchen, under watch, with my own hands, because a craftsman's last day belongs to his craft. Krell did not argue that one. He did something a great deal better than arguing. He specified the watch, and he specified it at 11 men. He named them in court from a list, and I knew every single name before he had finished the 4th, because they were on Mira Sedge's board, and I had spent 2 years writing to some of them. 11 of the immune, 11 men who had eaten my food somewhere between a siege and a market and had left a crust, a bone, a fishtail, 1 spoon of barley put back in the pot in front of me. Every one of them permanently and absolutely safe from me. Every one of them, therefore, completely trustworthy in a kitchen where I was going to be alone with knives and salt and the last thing an emperor would ever eat. It was flawless. I would have done the same. And it was the single largest mistake Sabin Krell made in 20 years, and he made it out of the strongest part of his mind, which is where the big mistakes always come from. Because he put me in a room for 2 days with 11 people I could not use for anything at all. Rin Corvale arrived on the 11th night, on her own, in a carter's coat, having come 400 miles in 6 days, and she got into the chancery by a route that had Sierra 9's handwriting on it. I told her to go home. I told her in the voice, which I had not used on anybody in a year and a half, and which does not work on her and never has. She said no. She said she had been made marshal in public and given a standing right to refuse me in front of anybody, and that she was exercising it, and that she had ridden 6 days to do it to my face rather than by letter. Then she sat down on the end of my cot and told me exactly what she thought of the plan, which was that it was the best plan available and that she hated it, and that if it worked, I would probably still be dead by Thursday. I said I knew. She said good, and that she was going to be in the hall, and that she was not going to do anything, and that not doing anything was going to be the hardest 4 days of her life. Yes, and Vask did one other thing during those 11 days that I did not ask him to do, and it is the reason Sabin Krell is not warden of anything today. He filed a return, not an accusation, a return in the ordinary form to the Chancery Audit Office, listing the crown disbursements issued out of the office of the warden of the table over 4 years, against the warrants held for them. There were 9 that had no warrant. One of them was a payment to a guild the warden was simultaneously abolishing. One of them was 4 years of wages for a company of 140 men that appeared in no muster roll in the Empire. Omri Falk opened an inquiry on the 4th day of my trial, and it was still running 2 years later, and Krell answered every single question in it correctly and in writing, and it destroyed him anyway, because that is what an audit is for. The kitchen under the Hall of Accounts is a magnificent room. 400 years old, 14 feet of chimney, 4 ranges, a cold room, a bread oven you could put a cart in, and the best iron I have ever cooked on. I went into it on the 2nd morning with 11 men who could not be bound, and I cooked for 2 days. I have never talked so much in my life. I asked them their names. Every one of them already knew that I knew. Then I asked them the only question I actually wanted the answer to, which is the one I had been putting in letters for 2 years and had never once had answered properly. I asked them why they had left it, not why they had eaten, why they had left it. Byrne Halloway had been a levy pikeman at 19. He said he left a crust at the siege because his sergeant had been hanged that morning for not stopping 2 men crossing the ford, and he could not make himself finish a plate in front of the man he blamed for it. A guild enforcer called Osk said he had left a fishtail because he had been told to, and had spent 4 years being congratulated for it in barracks by men who had not been there, and had never once been able to explain that he had not decided anything at all. One of them, whose name I am not going to write down because he asked me not to, said he had left a spoon of barley in the pot because he had a wife in Katter, and had believed correctly that eating my food meant never going home. 9 of the 11 had a reason like that. 2 of them said they had done it because they thought I was dangerous, and they still did. And one of those 2 was the most useful person in that room over those 2 days. They watched me build the meal. They had to. That was their whole function. And they did it properly, and they did not once relax. And I liked them for it. And on the 2nd night, at about the 11th hour, with the mise finished and everything cold rooms could hold, I asked the 11 of them whether they had eaten. They had not. They had been on watch for 2 days on their own bread, the way I had been watched by a knight 3 years earlier. So I told them that they were the only 11 people in the Empire I could feed with no consequence whatsoever, that nothing at all would happen to any of them, and that I was going to cook, and that they could sit down or not. 9 of them sat down, then 10, then the 11th, who was one of the 2 who thought I was dangerous, and who said he was only sitting because his feet hurt. I made them the same thing I had made 3 bandits in a road in a burned village: bone stock, barley, roots, fat, ramson, thyme, and a great deal of salt. It is not a fine dish. It is the first thing I ever cooked in this world, and it is still the best thing I know how to do. And I did it for 11 men who were guarding me on the last night of my life, and nothing happened to any of them at all. That is the only meal in this whole account that had no consequence. No binding, no failure, no counter moving, no line in the corner of my eye. 11 men ate food and were exactly as free at the end of it as they had been at the beginning. I have thought about that meal more than any other one I have ever made, including the beans, including the last one. Byrne Holloway put his head down on the table and cried the way a man is sick. Osk sat with a hand on the back of Byrne's neck and did not say anything at all. And the one whose name I am not writing asked me twice, in the middle of it, whether I was absolutely certain that nothing was going to happen to any of them. And Sabin Krell came down the stair, at about the first hour of the morning, to inspect the watch, and opened the door of the hall kitchen, and found 11 men who could never be bound sitting at a table, eating the condemned man's food, and one of them crying. He stood in that doorway for a long time. Nobody stood up. Nobody was doing anything they had been forbidden to do, and he checked. And I watched him check, and there was nothing. He said, to the room, that the watch would be relieved at the 6th hour. And I said the only thing I have ever said to that man that I regret, and I regret it because it was true, and because saying it out loud was for me and not for him. I said that he had spent 4 years building a company out of men I could never reach, and that he had never once considered that not being able to bind somebody is not the same thing as not being able to feed them. He looked at me. Then he said very quietly that he had never eaten anything I had made except once, and that it had been very good, and that he had been thinking about it every day for 4 years. Then he closed the door. Tasting had given me the emperor on the first morning of the trial, and I had carried it around for 11 days and not told one single person, not Vask, not Dane, not Rin. It did not name a dish. It named a temperature. It said anything hot, not since he was 6 years old. Kadric III has eaten every meal of his life through a taster. 2 tasters, in fact, since an attempt in his father's time. And a taster's plate goes out of a kitchen into a room, is portioned, is tasted, and then waits the required quarter of an hour before the emperor may touch it. The most powerful man in the world has not put a hot mouthful of food in his mouth since he was a child in a nursery. And every dish he has ever been served has arrived at the temperature of a room. Nobody in that palace has ever thought of it as a deprivation, because it is not one. It is a safety measure. It is correct. It is the schedule. And the schedule has kept 3 emperors alive. And on the 4th morning, in a hall with 400 people in it, I was going to be allowed to sit down with him at one table, in public, by a custom 400 years old, with the food arriving straight off the fire. They set one table in the middle of the hall of accounts, under the stand with the black book on it, and put 2 stools at it, and 400 people stood around the walls and did not sit down, because there was nowhere to sit. That is the whole of the last table. There is no ceremony attached to it. No words, no priest. There is a table, 2 stools, 1 meal, and everybody watching. And that is the entire point of a custom 400 years old. Sabin Krell made 3 attempts to stop it that afternoon, and every one of them was correct, and every one of them failed. And I want to give him all 3, because they were the last 4 hours of his career, and he fought them well. The first was the taster. He put it to the chancellor that the imperial protocol requires 2 tasters and a quarter of an hour, and that no custom can set aside the safety of the person of the emperor. Almari Falk ruled against him from the bench in about 9 words. He said the condemned man is the taster, and that is the whole of the custom. He said that is what the custom is, that the emperor eats what the condemned eats out of the same vessel at the same time, and that a taster would make the whole thing a piece of theater. The second was inspection. He asked to examine the kitchen, the vessel, the water, and every ingredient, personally, and Falk granted it immediately, because there was no reason not to. He was down there for 2 hours. He opened every jar. He tasted nothing, because he never did, but he had a chancery physician taste 14 things, and he stood over him while he did it. There was nothing to find. There has never been anything to find. Sabin Krell inspected the last meal of my life for 2 hours, and what he came back up with was a written statement that the food was wholesome, which he read into the record himself, because he was an honest man, and it was true. The third was the only one that had any chance, and he made it standing in front of the throne, in front of the whole court, 40 minutes before the hall was opened. He reminded the emperor of the rule. He said it out loud. Leave a bite, leave a crust, leave a bone, leave one bean, and the cook has nothing. He said he had done it himself, 4 years earlier, in a burned village, at a board across 2 barrels, and that it had cost him nothing but a mouthful. He said he had built 241 people out of that one sentence, and an entire company, and a charter, and that the rule had never once failed. And Kadrik III said, in front of about 100 people, that he knew, and that he had known since the winter, and that he had read the whole of Krell's own report on the subject 3 times. Then he said the thing that ended Sabin Krell's life's work about 90 minutes before the meal, and he said it kindly, which made it worse. He said that a man who intends to leave a bite has already decided the meal does not matter, and that he was about to sit down opposite somebody who had disassembled a field army with a cue, and that he was not going to spend that hour thinking about a crust. Krell said, very quietly, that with respect, that was exactly the error, and the emperor said yes, probably, and went to get changed. I cooked in the hall kitchen from the 9th hour with 11 men watching me who could not be bound, and Byrne Holloway kept the fire because he asked to. Here is what I made. Bone stock, run for 2 days and skimmed 6 times, reduced by half. Barley, parched on the plate first the way we do it at home, because it was rye that called a dragon and barley that started all of this. Roots turned and put in late so they still had something to bite. Fat off the top of the pot. Roasted ramson, thyme, and salt. Rather more than a court cook would ever use. A man who has eaten cold food for 29 years has been eating under seasoned food for 29 years. The palace kitchen had no idea about that, because the palace kitchen had never once been allowed to stand in a room and watch anybody eat what it made. 1 pot, 1 ladle, 2 bowls, nothing on that table that could be counted, nothing in 4s or 6s, nothing with a bone or a shell or a stone in it, and nothing at all on a side plate. I did not use portioning. That surprised the 11, and it surprised Rin afterward, and it is the only genuinely clever thing I did that whole day. Portioning makes a serving small enough to finish, but a small serving is a serving a man can look at and measure and plan, and I had learned that from a bean, and I was not going to hand Kadrik III a cup he could see the bottom of before he started. I served a full bowl, a working man's bowl. The kind we put out at the morning service for somebody who is going to be on a wall until dark. Because there is one thing that is true about food, that is genuinely hot, and it is the only piece of craft in this entire account that I would call a secret. You cannot eat it fast. You have to go slowly, from the edge in, a spoon at a time, and while you are doing that, you are not counting anything. You are just eating, for 11 minutes, like a person. They opened the hall at the 2nd hour afternoon. I came up out of the kitchen carrying the pot myself, because the custom says with his own hands, and I was not going to give anybody a reason to open a book. So 400 people watched a condemned man walk the whole length of the Hall of Accounts carrying a stock pot with a cloth wrapped round the handles. Rin Corval was on the left, 6 rows back, with her arms folded, doing nothing, exactly as she had said she would. Sir Dane Aylward was at the front, where he had stood at the head of every line for 3 years. Yesin Vask had a ledger, because of course he did. Sura 9 was somewhere in that hall, and I never saw her once. Ovain Rask stood at the back in uniform, and had been told not to come. And Sabin Krell stood 4 paces behind the Emperor's stool, with his case under his arm, where he had put himself, so that he could watch the bottom of the bowl. Kadrik III came in and sat down and put both hands flat on the table on either side of his place, and I have seen exactly one other man do that, and he was standing 4 paces behind him. I ladled his bowl first and set it down and stepped back. Then I ladled my own, out of the same pot, with the same ladle, and I ate 3 spoonfuls of it standing up in front of 400 people before he touched anything. Then I sat down. He picked up the spoon and went in at the edge, and the steam came up off it into his face, and he stopped. He did not stop the way Krell stopped over the beans. Krell had gone somewhere. This man had never been anywhere to go back to. He simply sat there with a spoon halfway up and his eyes watering from the heat coming off it, because nobody had ever done that to his face before. He said one thing during the whole meal, at about the 2nd minute, and he said it to nobody in particular. He said it was hot. Then he ate for 11 minutes and did not say anything else, and neither did I, and neither did 400 people, and I have never in my life heard a room that size make so little noise. I want to be honest that I stopped being able to think somewhere around the 8th minute. I ate my own bowl, and I could not tell you one single thing about it. At about the 9th minute, he turned the bowl a quarter turn, which is what a man does when he is working the edge and it has gone cool at the front. and I heard somebody behind me put a hand over their mouth. 4 mouthfuls left, then 3. Sabin Krell moved 1 step from 4 paces to 3. That is all he did. He did not speak, and he did not signal, and he did not need to. And I saw the Emperor register the sound of a boot on stone without looking up. 2. And Kadric III took the spoon round the bottom of that bowl the way you do when you want the last of the fat and the salt out of the corner. And he put the last of it in his mouth, and he set the spoon down on the table. The sound a spoon makes on a table is not a large sound. The page in the corner of my eye said 1 word. Bound. And nothing happened at all. Nobody screamed. Nobody drew anything. 400 people in the Hall of Accounts stood absolutely still and looked at a man sitting at a table with an empty bowl in front of him, and for about 10 seconds, not one person in that room breathed. He did not kneel. I want that on the record, because half the stories have him on his knees, and he was never on his knees for 1 second of it. He sat there. Then he said, in the flat, obliging voice that I had heard from a bandit in a road, and a mason on a wall, and a general's carters on a road station, that he would like to know what I wanted him to do. 400 people heard the Emperor of the World ask a cook for instructions, and I did not answer him. I have thought about that pause for a very long time, and I am not going to dress it up. It was not nobility. I had 2 thoughts in it, and the first one was the register, the charter, the barony, the road, the whole empire, handed to me across a table by a man who could not say no. The second thought was Dalm, sitting in a gap at the top of a lane with an axe across his knees, asking me whether he could stop now. So I asked him a question instead. That is all I did. It took about 4 seconds, and it is the only thing in this entire account I would not change. I asked him what he thought a bound emperor was worth. And Kadric III, who had told me in a small room with a fire in it that I had abolished the possibility of being talked out of anything, answered out of the one part of a man that the binding leaves alone, which is his trade. He said nothing. He said an emperor who cannot be argued with is not an emperor. He is a seal in a man's pocket, and that every law he signed from that afternoon onward would be worth precisely what the man behind him wanted it to be worth. Then he asked for the warrant, and Falk brought it, and he struck out the sentence of death with his own hand while he was still holding the throne, and dated it, and had 4 officers of the court witness it. And then he stood up and abdicated, in front of the whole court, in about 11 words, and put the crown in the hands of the chancellor as regent for his sister's son until the boy came of age. He got up from that table, not being emperor anymore, and he did it himself, and I did not ask him to, and I have spent the rest of my life explaining that to people who want it to be a better story. The page said, Bound Servant Kadric, Statecraft, Law, Court, 12 years, assigned to territory as council. Then it said, Territory rank advanced, Domain to kingdom. I sat in the Hall of Accounts with an empty bowl in front of me and looked at the last line that machine ever gave me, and I have never wanted anything less in my life. Omri Falk did the rest, and he did it in 9 days, and none of it was mine. He voided the Register and Section 9 on the grounds that no act of a compromised sovereign could stand, which meant the charter that had condemned me and the office that had hunted me both went out of existence in the same paragraph. He pardoned Rotbrook, chartered it, and taxed it. And the tax was fair, and we have paid it every year since, and I have never once complained about it in public. And he opened the audit on the office of the warden of the table, which had already been running since the 4th day of my trial, and which took 2 more years, and which Sabin Krell answered fully and correctly and lost. He was not hanged. He was not imprisoned. He was found to have disbursed crown money without warrant 6 times. He was removed from office, his charter was struck, and he was fined an amount he spent 14 years paying. He lives at Katter now. He is about 65. He is the only man in the empire who cannot be fed by me, and he is one of 241, and he is the only one of the 241 who knows exactly what he is. I write to him twice a year and have done since the audit closed. He answers every letter in a very good hand, usually with a correction in it and never with a complaint. And every spring, on the day of the last table, we lay a long table down the middle of the market at Rotbrook, and everybody in the town eats at it, and there is a place set at the end with a bowl in front of it. He comes. He has come 9 years running. He sits down at that place, and he does not eat one mouthful, and nobody says anything about it. And Wen puts a full bowl in front of him every single year in the same order as everybody else. So that is how it ends, and it is not the ending I would have written when I was 26 in a burned village with 2 cracked ribs. Kadric lives at Rotbrook. He runs the law school, and he is extremely good at it, and he argues with Rin Corval about jurisdiction the way other people breathe. I ask him things. I do not tell him things. I got that right by about the 4th month and not before. Rin is marshal of a kingdom that has no king in it, which she says is a filing error and which nobody has corrected in 9 years. Gorse holds the gate. Pell has 40 men on the roads and has never once taken a wage. Ren Otter's forge has 14 hands in it. Dama Austri moved the northern schedule twice more and complains about the seating. Sir Dane Aylward died 4 winters ago at 54 in his bed, and the last thing he did that anybody could call work was stand at the head of the line at the morning service and tell a stranger the terms. Mira Sedge died at 79 with the larder key still on her belt and the board still hanging in the kitchen, and we have never taken it down. 241 names under a line, and every one of them can eat at Rotbrook any day of the year, and about 90 of them do. Skorath is still last in the order of the line and still eats a cart every 11 days and has never tried to move up. And Wen is 22. She runs the kitchen at Rotbrook and the school under it. And there are 240 cooks working in 14 towns who learned the flower book from her. And their food does not do anything to anybody at all except feed them. I still cannot cook one mouthful for that girl. Not one. 4 years of an empire and a dragon and a throne. And the rule has not moved a hair. And it will not. And I have stopped picking at it. She cooks for me. Twice a day, in the order she wrote on a burned floor when she was 9. And I come last, after the children and the sick, and the workers and the bound, and the dragon. And I have never once been served early, and I would not allow it. That is what I would tell anybody who wants to know what the whole of it was actually for, and it is not the answer I expected to be giving at the end of it. I could take a man's whole life with one bowl, and I never found out how to give a girl her breakfast. And in the end, the answer was not a skill, and not a rank, and not a throne. It was 40 apprentices, and a book of batch numbers, and somebody else's hands.
Kellen Rowe never got the rule he wanted. He asked for a way to feed a starving village and was handed a fire that only lights for people who want him dead. So he stopped arguing with it. He told every man the terms before the bowl went down, stepped back from every plate, and refused for the rest of his life to hide anything inside food. He took an empire with a stock pot and could not make one breakfast for the child who mattered most. And what finally fed her was 40 apprentices, a book of batch numbers, and somebody else's hands. The power arrived on its own. Everything worth keeping he had to build.